In a time long past, when the world was still shaped by the sound of distant bells, the scent of burnt wood, and the echo of whispered prayers in stone chapels, there emerged in Europe an era shrouded in mist. Not only physical mist, but also the mist of uncertainty, silence, fear, and transformation. This era would be known centuries later as the Middle Ages, a period of more than 1,000 years separating the fall of the Roman Empire from the birth of the modern world. And through this vast corridor of time, we will now walk gently tonight, guided only by the dim light of curiosity and the warmth of imagination. Perhaps by the end, you will realize that the Middle Ages were not quite what school books taught you. Perhaps it was at once a time of shadows and of light, of suffering and of discovery, of silence and of cries muffled by the smoke of pyres and the gold of altars. To you who now lie down, or perhaps are just resting your body and eyes while the world outside slows down, welcome. This is a journey meant to be listened to with a calm heart and an open mind. There will be no rush here, only slow, gentle steps, following the rhythm of an ancient time when clocks were bells and the day was measured by the position of the sun in the sky. Prepare yourself to cross centuries, to see kings and peasants, to hear bells and whispers, to understand not only what was said about this time, but everything that was forgotten, hidden, or burned. Prepare to discover what lay behind castles, monasteries, and witches, what existed in the hearts of men and women who lived between the fear of plague and the promise of paradise. This is not a story told in haste. It is a story for those who wish to listen slowly. When we speak of the Middle Ages, it's common to hear expressions like the Dark Ages, as if that immense stretch of time were a long, starless night. But was it really? Or was that label created by those who came later, by the men of the Renaissance who needed a historical enemy to glorify their own light? Perhaps the Middle Ages weren't so dark after all. Perhaps it was a cloudy sky where some stars still shone, shyly, behind the clouds. Because while war consumed kingdoms and plague swept away entire families, other forces were also taking root. Monks copied books by hand to preserve ancient knowledge. Women healed diseases with herbs. Craftsmen turned stone into cathedrals. And boys looked up at the sky, trying to understand what those distant lights were. We will speak about all of this, but without haste, because this is a story to be heard like one listens to the rain outside, with quiet attention. We will walk through snow-covered villages, travel dirt roads lined with wheat fields, and hear the footsteps of time echoing in silent monasteries. In the background, always the sound of the bell ringing, calling for prayer, for work, or for death. Prepare to visit the world of alchemists who dreamed of turning lead into gold and discovering eternal life. We will also explore the darker side, the smoke of the pyres where women accused of witchcraft were burned, the muffled cries of children exploited in fields and workshops, and the heavy silence of cities struck by the Black Death, where even the bells stopped ringing. But tonight you are not alone on this journey. We are here together, guided by ancient voices, by buried stories, and by mysteries that crossed the centuries. Over the next hours, you will be led down a quiet path, but one full of revelations. And even when sleep comes and your eyes close, this story will remain with you, like an ancient dream from a forgotten age. Because in the Middle Ages, more than kings and crusades, there was life, there was faith, there was fear, there was magic, and there was the desire to understand the world, something that remains alive within us to this day. Now take a deep breath, let your body rest, and allow the story to begin. When we speak about the beginning of the Middle Ages, it is inevitable that we first look toward the ruins of an earlier world, specifically the remains of what was once the Western Roman Empire, that vast political and military machine that for centuries dominated not only territories, but also mentalities, languages, social structures, and collective dreams. The empire that built roads, cities, temples, and laws eventually fell, and the sound of that collapse echoed across generations, not as a sudden crash, but as a slow unraveling, like the final embers of a dying fire, fading one by one until only smoke remained in the air. The fall of Rome didn't happen in a single day, nor in a single year. Though history books often point to the precise date of 476 after Christ, when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic leader named Odoacer. But the truth is that long before that, The empire was already trembling from within, corroded by economic crises, political instability, rampant corruption, civil wars, and external pressures from peoples referred to, with fear and disdain, as barbarians. Rome, which had long symbolized order, began to fragment like an old mirror struck by silent cracks. Cities lost their vitality, trade routes were interrupted, and little by little the Roman state could no longer protect its borders or feed its people. The legions grew thin, taxes increased, and many peasants abandoned their lands, fleeing war, looting, and hunger. What followed was a long period of adaptation, chaos, and transformation, during which new forces rose to fill the void left by the fallen Colossus. It is within this landscape of ruins and new beginnings that the era we now call the Middle Ages was born, not as a finished construction, but as an improvised fabric, stitched together from the scraps of a collapsing world. Picture a vast continent where roads no longer led to the same places, where Roman coins lost their value, and where local kings emerged to defend their own territories. It was in this fragmented mosaic that the Germanic peoples, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, Lombards, began to occupy European lands, imposing their customs and traditions while also absorbing many aspects of the old empire. In some areas, ancient Roman villas became fortresses. In others, entire cities were abandoned, and grass overtook the plazas. It was as if civilization had been put to sleep, uncertain whether it would awaken the same or utterly transformed. Aqueducts dried up, libraries were forgotten, and in the midst of it all, fear became the common language. Yet even in this atmosphere of uncertainty, something new began to sprout. The ancient world was vanishing, but in its place, a new logic of power, faith, and survival slowly took shape. The center of the universe shifted from the city to the countryside. Castles began to rise on hills, like watchtowers in an age of constant threat. And the Catholic Church, once one of many religions within the empire, now solidified its place as the sole spiritual light in a darkened time. Bishops gained political strength, monks retreated into monasteries and began copying manuscripts by hand, preserving fragments of ancient knowledge. It was the quiet rebirth of a civilization, not through swords, but through faith and isolation. Meanwhile, most people, men, women, and children, were simply trying to survive. Far from imperial decisions, peasants lived under the weight of the land, the climate, and the local lords. Food was scarce, disease common, and life expectancy short, but there was also a deep sense of community, of religiosity, and of adaptation to the new order that was emerging from the ashes. Even in the harshest periods, there were fairs, local festivals, songs, and fleeting moments of joy amidst daily hardships. The Middle Ages didn't begin with a proclamation, but as a fog that slowly spread across a wounded world. And so, as the centuries progressed, what seemed like a time of endings was, in truth, a time of gestation. What the Renaissance thinkers would later call the Dark Ages was in many ways a long night of transition, in which seeds were planted in darkness to bloom centuries later. Therefore, as we walk calmly through medieval history, perhaps we should keep our eyes wide open to its contradictions. What appears to be ruin may be foundation. What seems like silence may be resistance. What looks like fear may, in secret, be preparing the ground for courage. Close your eyes if you're still awake, take a deep breath, and let the dust of Rome settle slowly. Because now, with the empire dead and the barbarians building new kingdoms upon its ruins, the true journey into the Middle Ages begins. When we think of the Middle Ages, it's easy to picture grand castles, knights in shining armor, and kings seated on golden thrones, but this image, repeated in films and paintings, represents only a tiny fraction of reality. The true Middle Ages were not in the stone halls of nobles, but in the small huts of wood and mud scattered across the fields. It was in the dirty hands of the peasants that medieval life truly took place. It was there, in distant villages and modest plantations, that life unfolded at its slow rhythm, marked by the seasons, the harvests, and whispered prayers over a scarce piece of bread. In this chapter, we will walk slowly through that silent, harsh, and almost always invisible daily life, which supported the entire structure of a time that lasted for centuries. Now imagine a grey morning, the ground still wet with dew, and the sound of a distant bell calling for work and prayer. A man awakens on his straw mattress, beside his wife and 3 children who share the same space, covered by thick blankets made of coarse wool. There is no privacy, no comfort. Light filters through the cracks in the poorly fitted wood, and the smoke from the previous night's fire still lingers in the air, making the room hazy and the smell of soot cling to the clothes. The first meal of the day is a piece of dark, hard bread made from barley or rye flour, and a sip of turnip or onion broth. There is no meat, no fresh milk, except on special occasions. Hunger is a frequent but silent companion, a ghost that haunts every home without fanfare, just ever present day after day. The peasant leaves early. He goes to the fields, where he spends the day tilling the land with simple tools, often inherited, made of wood and worn iron. The plough is pulled by skinny oxen, and the physical effort is constant. The land is not his. It belongs to a feudal lord, a local noble who offers protection in exchange for labor and a share of the harvest. It's an unequal relationship, but one rooted in tradition. The peasant knows he must give part of what he grows, pay fees, help maintain roads, and, in many cases, offer his children for the Lord's service, whether as servants, laborers, or in times of war, as improvised soldiers. Life is hard, but it is also stable, predictable, like the seasons that dictate the rhythm of everything. Women also work, and hard. They take care of the house, the children, food preparation, fabric production, milking the cows, gathering herbs, and often help in the fields. They are the ones who keep life running behind the scenes. Many are midwives, healers, prayer women, women of quiet knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. And it is precisely that knowledge that later would be viewed with suspicion by the church, associated with witchcraft and heresy. But for now, these women are essential. Without them, there is no future, no remedy, no balance in the medieval daily life. Children begin working early. By 6 or 7 years old, they already accompany their parents to the fields, learning to tend animals, carry water, and gather firewood. The concept of childhood as we know it today does not exist. They do play when there's time, with handmade toys like cloth dolls or wooden wheels, but they grow up fast. Life does not allow much delay. Life expectancy is short. Many don't reach 40. Simple diseases, easily treatable today, were fatal. There were no antibiotics, no modern hospitals. There were herbs, prayers, and faith. Villages are small. Some have only a few dozen people. Everyone knows each other. They share stories, labor, sorrows, and small joys. Religious festivals are the main occasions for leisure and gathering. Weddings, baptisms, harvests, and patron saints mark the calendar. On these occasions, there is music played with rudimentary instruments, circle dances, and shared food. They are rare but precious moments. Rites of union amidst daily hardship. Religion is the guiding thread of peasant life. Everything is explained by the will of God. Good weather, storms, illness, difficult childbirth, bountiful harvests, or harsh winters. But insecurity is constant. At any moment, a neighboring lord might want to expand his land. An army might pass through and pillage the village. The plague might arrive. Fear is an invisible resident. And yet, life goes on. The peasant rises. The woman prepares food. The children play and help, and the day repeats itself. There are no dreams of social mobility. The structure is rigid. To be born a peasant is to die a peasant. Mobility barely exists, but there is faith. And faith for many is enough. The promise of an eternal paradise of reward after death is the most powerful comfort the church offers, and thus the centuries pass. Slow, silent, made up of millions of humble lives, erased from official history, but essential for keeping everything standing. Because while kings waged wars, the peasants planted. While monks copied books, women cared for life. While priests preached, the anonymous endured. And that's why tonight, in telling the story of the Middle Ages, we choose to give voice to those who never had one, to those who lived among mud and smoke, under the weight of fear, but also under the quiet warmth of hope, because they, not the battle heroes, are the ones who truly made the Middle Ages happen. Now, close your eyes. Hear the wind rustling through the crops. Smell the bread baking in a clay oven. See the shadows of trees swaying over the thatched rooftops. And remember, behind every castle there was always an invisible village, and it is there that the real story begins. If today, when we close our eyes and think of a child, we imagine freedom, laughter, running, and discovery, it is important to understand that during the Middle Ages, that image simply did not exist. The idea of childhood as a protected phase of human life is a very recent invention in history. For centuries, and in an especially harsh way during the Middle Ages, a child was, above all, a small part of a larger system, a labor force, a family duty, a body to be shaped, controlled, obedient. There was no time for fantasy, no space for rebellion. There was only the weight of obligations that began early, long before maturity, long before any choice. It was common for boys and girls at 5 or 6 years old to be inserted into the family's productive cycle. The children of peasants woke with their parents, still in the dark of early dawn, and were given simple tasks: fetching water from the well, feeding animals, gathering firewood, cleaning the stable, watching over the chickens. And as the years passed, those tasks grew in complexity, weight, and responsibility. By 8 or 9, many already knew how to plow the land, reap with a sickle, tend to entire herds, and even take over the work in the fields if a parent fell ill. Exhaustion was silent. There was no one to hear it, no one to name it. Only the repeated cycle to be born, grow, work, and die. Girls, in turn, were trained from a very young age in household duties, caring for younger siblings, weaving fabrics, and preparing food. By 7 or 8, they spun thread, sewed, cared for the sick, and cooked for the family. Upon reaching puberty, many were already promised in marriage or served as maids in noble houses. Sometimes childhood ended even more cruelly. If the family was in debt, it was common for children to be handed over as servants to other lords, as payment. Other times, they were sent to monasteries or convents, where they would grow under strict rules, often without ever returning home. There were also children raised directly under the church's care, boys sent to monasteries to become monks, scribes, priests. Some of those lives would be saved from poverty through sacred vows, but many others would be marked by punishment, isolation, forced celibacy, and deep emotional repression. Medieval childhood was silent, not out of peace, but out of submission. There was fear, there was discipline, and there was the weight of a faith that explained everything, and including suffering. Parents believed they were doing the right thing. That teaching a child to work early was building character, was protection from hunger, was securing a future, even if that future was nothing more than the repetition of their own hard lives. In the cities, when they began to grow, the scenario was not much better. With the rise of medieval guilds, blacksmiths, tailors, shoemakers, goldsmiths, came apprentices. They were usually boys handed over by their families to the masters of the trades at 7, 8, or 9 years old. They worked in exchange for lodging, food, and the promise of learning a craft. But that promise was uncertain. Many apprentices suffered physical abuse, mistreatment, and were exploited for years without any guarantee. They slept in the back of workshops, ate leftovers, and spent their days serving the master tirelessly. Learning was hard, freedom non-existent, punishment frequent. And if we look at wars and castles, we will also find children serving feudal lords. Young pages, sons of low-ranking nobles, were sent to the castles of other lords to learn the arts of war, chivalry, and court etiquette. Their lives may have seemed better than that of peasants, but they were far from gentle. These boys were forced into military discipline early on. They learned to fight, to serve at the table, to dress knights, to accompany their masters on hunts and into battle. Many died before ever wielding a sword. Childhood in the castle was also labor, simply wrapped in silk, but still labor. There was no room for vulnerability, sadness, or tears. A child who got sick too often was seen as weak, and weakness was a risk to the group's survival. So they were raised to endure, to obey, to resist. The idea of play was limited to rare moments of rest, and the toys were made from whatever was available: cloth dolls, wooden carts, hoops, pebbles. But all of that was fleeting. Duty always came first, and the duty was to serve. The parents, the Lord, the church, the destiny assigned at birth. And even so, even in that harsh environment, there were dreams. Some kept in silence, others whispered at night. Dreams of owning land, of learning to read, of being free, of living better than their parents. But most of those dreams died young, because the medieval world was not built for children's dreams. It was built to keep the wheel turning, and children, like little gears, turned with it, until they broke or disappeared. Today, as we look back quietly into the darkness of the centuries, we may hear, if we listen with open hearts, the sound of small feet running through the fields, fragile fingers molding clay, tired eyes facing the sunrise with the resignation of someone who already knows, even so young, that the day will be hard, long, and without respite. And that is why telling this story matters, so that the silence that covered those childhoods, forgotten for so long, may be broken, at least once, by gentle words. Now close your eyes. Imagine the sound of little feet in the mud, a shy smile under soot, and a distant voice saying, "It's still early, let's go to the field." Because in the Middle Ages, growing up was, above all, starting far too soon. If there is one constant yet invisible presence throughout the long journey of the Middle Ages, it is that of the woman. Silent in official chronicles, absent from theological treatises, ignored in epic songs yet irreplaceable in the daily life of villages, castles, convents, birthing tents, and smoky kitchens, the medieval woman was viewed by many as a being of second rank, inferior by nature, fragile by definition, sinful by inheritance. And yet, even under the weight of that cultural construct, she upheld the world with silent gestures, with calloused hands, with whispered prayers and eyes that carried generations. Her role was one of resistance, even when the discourse around her was one of submission. And that is why tonight we give voice to them, to the forgotten, the burned, the mothers, the witches, the saints, and the peasant women. In the villages, the woman was the foundation of survival. She cared for the home, which was not a home as we imagine today, but a rudimentary hut, often shared with animals, without windows, without beds, without privacy. She prepared the food, sewed, spun flax, gathered medicinal herbs. She raised children, often 8, 9 or more, knowing she would likely lose some to hunger or simple illnesses. She helped her husband in the fields, tended the garden, cleaned the stables. There were women who gave birth and returned to work in the fields the very same day, because there was no other choice. Time did not pause for blood, nor for pain. The woman was also the guardian of popular knowledge. She knew which roots healed, which leaves lowered fever, which words soothed the soul. She was a midwife, a healer, a folk priestess, and for that very reason dangerous in the eyes of the church. For centuries, female knowledge, especially that which bypassed clerical control, was persecuted, labeled superstition, heresy, a pact with the devil. And when fear met ignorance, the pyres were lit. Many women were burned alive for daring to exist outside the norm, for knowing too much, for not submitting, for being widows, spinsters, poor, mysterious, or simply different. No proof was needed, just suspicion, and a priest's word. In monasteries and convents, some women found refuge. Some were forced there by their families, others fled marriage, and others were moved by sincere faith. There, among prayers and copied manuscripts, some managed to study, write, teach. They had names: Hildegard von Bingen, Prosvita of Gandersheim, Herard of Landsberg, women who dared to think, compose, interpret scripture. Yet even there, the veil of silence was thick. Women were watched, their words revised. Chastity was imposed, the body denied, the flesh linked to sin. And still, within those stone walls, many built quiet forms of resistance, small rebellions of ink and parchment. In courts and castles, the female destiny varied. Daughters of nobles were promised in marriage at a young age, often still children. Marriages were not for love, but for alliances, for politics, for land. A woman was currency, a bridge, a symbol of honor. And she was constantly watched. Virginity before marriage was demanded. Fidelity afterward was monitored. Men could stray, women could not. And even so, some stood out: queens, regents, warriors, patrons, but always under the stern gaze of the church and society. A woman with a voice was suspicious, a woman with power a threat. There were also women of the streets, prostitutes, often pushed to the margins by hunger, by loss, by rejection. Some found protection in city-regulated brothels. Others wandered. Others served silently the desires of those who publicly condemned them. They were called sinners, Yet they served the same lords who prayed on Sundays, and few escaped violence, contempt, and abandonment. And in the midst of all this, there was love. Yes, love. Between hardship and obedience, between duty and punishment, there were eyes that searched for one another, hands that touched in secret, promises whispered into ears. Because even in the Middle Ages, where everything seemed controlled, the heart still found ways to beat off rhythm. There were women who loved, who lost, who wrote letters never read. There were anonymous poems. There was longing. There were goodbyes without return. There were griefs not allowed. And there was faith. A faith unlike that from the pulpits. A faith made of silence, of endurance, of small daily miracles. Today, as we look back, we don't see their names in the great books, but we can feel their presence in the details, in the bread kneaded with wounded hands, in the dry leaves kept to heal fever, in the prayers repeated until sleep. The women of the Middle Ages were not just victims. They were strength. They were memory. They were root. They were the invisible thread that stitched together every day from sunrise to sunset. Close your eyes if you can. Imagine the sound of a loom working late into the night, the scent of herbs drying by the fire, the murmur of a lullaby sung between clay walls. Because even when everything seemed dark, there were women lighting small candles inside their homes, holding up the world without asking for praise. The Middle Ages were an era marked by a constant search for meaning, for protection, for order amid the chaos brought on by war, disease, unpredictable harvests, and premature deaths. And in this landscape of uncertainty and danger, one institution rose as both refuge and authority, as both answer and judgment, as both consolation and condemnation: the Catholic Church. Present in every aspect of life, from birth to the grave, the Church was not merely a place of faith, it was a system. It was a spiritual map and a social mechanism. It was law, it was voice, it was shadow and light at once. And for more than 1,000 years, it did not simply guide soul. It shaped kingdoms, crowned kings, burned scrolls and bodies alike. Above all, it was the center. From baptism to the deathbed, no moment in medieval existence escaped the Church's reach. A newborn was immediately taken to be baptized, for the idea of original sin demanded that every human come into the world already stained, already in need of purification. Then came the sacraments throughout life: confession, communion, marriage or ordination, last rites. Each marked a stage of the earthly journey, and all passed through the hands of the clergy. The priest was not only the celebrant of Mass, but the counselor, the moral judge, the mediator between man and God. And God in the Middle Ages was not loving above all. He was judge, watchful, punitive. Most of the population was illiterate. They did not read the scriptures. They knew the faith through the priest's words, through stained glass windows, through chants in Latin, a language the people didn't understand, but respected. Sermons spoke of sin, of hell, of eternal punishment. They spoke of saints, martyrs, and miracles, and fear became a powerful tool. The ideas of purgatory, final judgment, and punishment for sinful acts were repeated so often that many peasants lived under constant guilt and surveillance. It was not enough to do good. One had to confess, one had to do penance, one had to obey. Faith was both comfort and chain. In monasteries and cathedrals, the Church's power was even more visible. Great architectural works, built over decades or centuries with massive stones carried by human hands, rose in the middle of villages as signs of divine presence. Monks copied ancient texts, preserved Greek and Roman knowledge, and kept the flame of reading alive in dark times. But they also censored. They erased passages deemed dangerous. They rewrote history through the lens of faith. Truth was molded page by page between prayer and silence, and in convents, nuns prayed and fasted, some seeking mystical ecstasy, others simply trying to endure a life of imposed reclusion. If faith was personal, the Church's power was collective and absolute. Bishops owned land, collected taxes, and held more authority than nobles. The Pope in Rome was more than a spiritual leader. He was king of kings. He decided wars. He excommunicated monarchs. He blessed crusades. His word was taken as the voice of God. And when the Inquisition was established, the Church also became a tribunal. It judged in secret, condemned without defense, and used torture as a legitimate tool of revelation, all in the name of the purity of faith, all in the name of a heaven that few would reach. And yet, For many, the church was all they had. It was shelter during winter. It offered soup to the poor. It cared for the sick in the first medieval hospitals. It heard the cries of widows, protected orphans, buried the forgotten. In many villages, the priest was the only figure of authority. He could read, count, listen, and despite all the abuses and excesses, there were good priests. There were holy monks. There were nuns who gave their lives in full service. There was sincere faith, suffering faith, resilient faith. The church was made of men, and for that reason, also made of contradictions. Over time, voices began to rise in challenge. Poor preachers, rebellious monks, heretical movements that called for a return to the simplicity of the early Christians. But the church's response was always firm. Repression. Knowledge was centralized. Doctrine inflexible. Salvation a rare commodity. Those who did not bow were silenced. Those who thought differently were labeled enemies, and many were burned as examples. Today, when we recall this powerful, ever-present, contradictory institution, we must look with calm eyes and attentive ears. Because the Church of the Middle Ages was not just a temple, it was the heart of a civilization, a heart that beat loudly, that imposed rhythms that bled and healed, that destroyed and built, that loved and feared at the same time. Now close your eyes. Imagine the sound of the organ inside a cathedral, the flicker of candlelight, the deep voice of the priest chanting hymns, and in the background the whisper of ancient faith, saying that everything, absolutely everything, was in God's hands, or rather, in the hands of those who claim to speak in His name. Somewhere in time, between the sacred and the profane, between the promise of heaven and the fear of hell, an institution was born that would be remembered for centuries as a symbol of dread and silence, the Inquisition. And to understand it, one must not rush nor judge hastily. One must approach calmly. One must dive deeply into the logic of an era in which faith was absolute, doubt was sin, and dissent could be not just dangerous, but fatal. The Inquisition did not arise from a single decision. It was the result of a world that feared chaos, feared heresy, feared anything different. A world that saw fire not only as destruction, but as purification. Officially created in the 13th century under Pope Gregory IX, the Inquisition was born as an ecclesiastical tribunal designed to identify, judge, and punish so-called heretics, those who dared to think outside the doctrine, live outside the norm, or believe in alternative interpretations of Christian faith. And what exactly was heresy? It was anything that refused to kneel before the dominant discourse. It was reading the Bible independently. It was following ancient folk practices. It was spreading ideas that challenged the Church's authority. It was being a Cathar, a Waldensian, or simply someone who asked questions. The inquisitors were monks chosen from the most obedient and disciplined orders, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, men trained not only in theology, but in the art of interrogation. They traveled from town to town, setting up temporary tribunals, summoning villagers to denounce their neighbors. Hearings were held in secret. The accused did not know who accused them. They had no right to a lawyer. Often they didn't even know the specific charges. A rumor, a misinterpreted gesture, jealousy, vengeance, any of these could set the wheel of judgment in motion. Torture was a legal tool. Justified as a means of extracting confessions, it was administered under formal guidelines, though rarely respected. Victims were tied, stretched, suspended, suffocated with soaked cloths, burned with hot irons. The body spoke when the mind could no longer resist, and what was sought was not merely confession, but reaffirmation of the faith's power. Many confessed to things they hadn't done, just to make the pain stop. Others remained silent until silence itself became eternal. And when sentences were delivered, they were public. The so-called autos de fe were solemn ceremonies with mass, processions, and the reading of punishments. The condemned wore special garments, the San Benito, a robe painted with flames and demons as a warning to the people. Some were forced to recant in public squares, others were branded, and those deemed irredeemable were handed over to civil authorities to carry out the maximum penalty, death by fire, always justified by the claim that the soul was what mattered, and that the burning body was merely a vessel for its release from error. Among the accused were people of all ages, professions, and classes, men and women, peasants and nobles, intellectuals and illiterates. Many women were accused of witchcraft even when all they knew were herbal teas and salves. Many Jewish converts, the so-called New Christians, were persecuted for secretly maintaining ancient rituals. Many scientists like Giordano Bruno were accused of challenging the cosmic order established by doctrine. And others, like Galileo Galilei, were forced to deny their own discoveries, even knowing they were right. But the Inquisition was not only fire, it was fear, constant fear, fear inside the home, fear in children's eyes, fear in gestures, the fear of saying the wrong thing, of dreaming the wrong dream, of seeming different. The Inquisition shaped medieval silence. It turned faith into surveillance, and it made sin something that could be invented, manipulated, negotiated, because in those days, truth had an owner, and to question it was a risk few dared to take. Even so, many resisted, some in secret, others with open courage. Many wrote, fled, hid books, sheltered fugitives, kept ancient rites alive in their hearts. The memory of these acts of resistance, though often forgotten, still resonates in the burned pages, the erased names, the toppled statues. Because behind every fire that was lit, there was a story worthy of being told softly and persistently, as we are doing now. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the empty square, the bell ringing 3 times, and a procession approaching from afar. There is no hurry, just a whisper in the air saying that even faith, when guided by fear, can become punishment. And even in the darkest of nights, the story deserves to be told with tenderness, so that the past may rest, so that sleep may come, so that silence at last is no longer fear, but peace. It was night, and the wind passed through the trees as if it carried ancient secrets. Inside, in a cabin far from the village, a woman blew gently over a clay bowl where herbs dried under candlelight. Around her, jars of roots, fabrics embroidered with symbols, and a respectful silence, not born of fear, but of knowing, of keeping, of healing, and precisely because of that, of being dangerous. This is how the story of medieval witchcraft begins, not with demons nor imaginary pacts, but with real women, with folk knowledge, with female voices that dared to exist outside the walls of the church, and for that, they were persecuted, erased, burned, and later transformed into monsters by the very ones who once begged for their help. In the Middle Ages, the figure of the witch was not yet the caricature with a crooked nose and flying broomstick. She was a woman from the community, someone who understood the body, nature, and pain. She knew which roots cured headaches, which leaves eased cramps, which gestures soothed difficult births. She knew the cycles of the moon, the rhythms of the earth, the moods of blood. And for a male-dominated society that feared anything it didn't understand or couldn't control, that was simply unacceptable. Knowledge that didn't come from the church was seen as a threat. And female knowledge, intuitive, ancestral, communal, was the most dangerous of all. These women were called healers, midwives, witches, prayer women. Some were indeed part of family or regional traditions. Others were simply elderly women who lived alone. Others still were women with bodies deemed too seductive, voices too firm, gestures too free. As the church consolidated its power, control over the female body became central. Witchcraft then began to be constructed as an enemy of the faith, and over time the symbols reversed. The cauldron became a pagan altar, the herbs became poison, the cat became a demon, and the woman an enemy of God. The 14th and 15th centuries marked the beginning of a true witch hunt, driven by persecution manuals, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487. Written by inquisitors, this book taught how to identify, judge, and eliminate witches, with precise instructions on interrogations, torture, and forced confessions. It claimed that women were more prone to sin due to their natural weakness, that they were seductive, deceitful, carnal, and therefore better suited to serve the devil. The idea spread quickly, and before long any woman who deviated from expected behavior could be accused. A widow who refused to remarry, a young woman who laughed too loudly, an old woman who talked to herself. That was enough. Trials were public, and even when secret, they left deep scars on communities. A single accusation, sometimes born of envy, vengeance, or suspicion, and the woman was taken, interrogated, pressured to confess, forced to name others. In many cases, there was no way out. Confessing meant sealing one's fate. Denying only delayed the inevitable. The stake was the final destination. And the people watched, torn between horror and relief. Because as the fire consumed that woman, it also burned away the fear of what she represented. Freedom, knowledge, difference. But not all witches were burned. Some resisted, some fled, some hid their knowledge in secret books, passed from generation to generation. Some were protected by those who recognized their value, and others, even without leaving a name, left a legacy. Because knowledge does not die with the body. It spreads like ash on the wind. And that is why centuries later we still smell the burning herbs, we still hear the whispers, we still carry the fear and the fascination of witches. In truth, the history of witchcraft is, above all, the history of the fear of liberated femininity, of the body that bleeds, gives birth, heals dreams, of the thought that does not bow, of the woman who speaks without asking permission, the one who plants, who feels, who looks to the sky and understands its signs. So now, in this moment of silence and reflection, we let the fire die down gently, and we let these women walk with us, not as ghosts, but as ancestors, as midwives of memory, as healers of history. Close your eyes. Smell the rosemary burning slowly. Hear the clinking of glass bottles on an old wooden shelf, and let the breeze carry away the echoes of silenced voices. Because tonight, at least tonight, they may finally be heard in peace. In a dark room lit only by the glow of candles and embers, a man in a worn tunic mixes colored powders in clay bowls. Around him, glass tubes, hand-drawn symbols, books written in an incomprehensible script. There is silence, there is focus, there is a purpose that goes far beyond the material, to discover the secret of existence. Alchemy in the Middle Ages was not merely an attempt to transform metals into gold, it was a philosophical journey, a spiritual quest, a secret path amid the noisy world of faith and fear. It was science before science, faith before organized religion. At its core, it was the art of transformation, of the world, of substances, and above all, of oneself. Contrary to popular belief, alchemy did not originate in Europe. Its roots are ancient and deep, crossing through Egypt, Greece, India, and the Arab world. The Arabs, in fact, were largely responsible for preserving, developing, and disseminating alchemical knowledge during the Middle Ages, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, where the coexistence of Christians, Jews, and Muslims produced one of the richest cultural and intellectual melting pots of the era. It was through the translations of Arabic texts that Christian Europe began to encounter names like Geber, Al-Razi, and Avicenna, masters who combined medicine, chemistry, philosophy, and spirituality into a unified body of knowledge. The figure of the medieval alchemist is shrouded in mystery. Often it was someone isolated, someone living on the outskirts of towns, or even inside monasteries in improvised laboratories. An unrelenting scholar, one who spent countless nights studying the behavior of fire, the distillation time of liquids, the reaction of obscure substances. But it was more than that. The alchemist believed that matter had a soul, that everything in the universe was connected by invisible laws, that a divine plan was written into the stars and the metals, and that the key to unlocking this plan lay within oneself. Among the great goals of alchemy, 3 stood out: the transmutation of base metals into gold, the discovery of the elixir of long life, and the creation of the philosopher's stone, a mythical element capable of accomplishing both and more. But to the true alchemist, these goals were symbolic. Gold represented spiritual perfection, the elixir, harmony between body and soul, the philosopher's stone, full consciousness. That's why many alchemical texts were written in coded language, full of metaphors, images, symbols, and riddles, not because the secret was to be hidden, but because it could only be understood by those prepared to receive it. In practice, alchemy contributed to the birth of modern chemistry. Alchemists developed laboratory techniques that would become fundamental centuries later: distillation, sublimation, calcination, crystallization. They studied mercury, sulfur, and salt. They invented instruments. They observed reactions, all while being closely watched by the church, which regarded them with suspicion. To many theologians, alchemy was dangerous, disguised magic, a human attempt to reach the divine through knowledge, not through faith. And in the Middle Ages, that was considered heresy. Some alchemists were persecuted, others protected by curious nobles. Still others hid their studies behind false names, ambiguous signatures, or inside religious works. Knowledge traveled in secret, like an underground current. Among the most well-known are Nicolas Flamel, a Parisian copyist later enveloped in legends about the philosopher's stone, Arnaud de Villanova, who merged alchemy and medicine, and Roger Bacon, a Franciscan monk who blended theology, natural sciences, and chemical experimentation, and who, for that, spent years in imprisonment and under surveillance. Alchemy was also a solitary practice, an inner path. The laboratory was a mirror, the furnace a reflection of the soul. The alchemist sought not only to transform metals but himself. Working with lead, with mud, with impurities was, ultimately, working with the darkest parts of the self. And when the fire purified the elements, it also purified the spirit. That's why many alchemical treatises speak of spiritual stages, internal trials, enlightenment. Alchemy, deep down, was a bridge between the visible and the invisible, between the material world and the world of ideas. And today, when we look back with respect, we realize that these men, and yes, also some women, were not merely playing with flasks and formulas. They were trying to decipher nature. They were trying to touch mystery with their hands. They were seeking the divine in matter, and perhaps in some moment of the night, amid vapors and silence, they came closer to the truth than we dare to imagine. Now close your eyes, hear the gentle crackling of fire in a brazier, smell the sweet perfume of burning resins, and imagine an old book, handwritten, lying open on a stone table. On the page, a symbol, gold, sun, soul, light. Because alchemy, though forgotten, still pulses in the heart of the human mystery, and gently leads us into the next dream. On moonless nights when the torches were extinguished and the bells had rung their final toll, there was something that made medieval men lift their eyes. In silence, in reverence, in awe. The sky, a deep, dark sky, studded with thousands of lights that shimmered like distant promises. In the Middle Ages, looking at the sky was more than mere contemplation. It was an attempt to understand the divine. It was reading a scripture that had not been written in letters but in constellations, each star a sign, each eclipse a warning, each planet a celestial will. And it was within this theater of lights that medieval astronomy flourished, between faith and reason, between fear and curiosity. But before it became science, astronomy was spirituality. The heavens were considered the domain of God. That was where he dwelled with his angels, his saints, his judgments, and it was also from there that the signs of earthly events were believed to come: wars, harvests, plagues, births, and deaths. That's why monks, clerics, and scholars spent hours observing the stars. They tried to understand the rhythms of the heavens, to predict the cycles of the earth, and in doing so, they wrote a kind of celestial liturgy, where the movement of stars was read as prayer. In monasteries, where time was not divided into hours but into prayers, lauds, vespers, compline, the monks observed the skies with almost liturgical attention. They noted the phases of the moon, planetary passages, the appearance of comets. Everything was recorded, and those records became precious, not only for timekeeping, but also for organizing agricultural and religious life. Most Christian festivals were tied to the lunar calendar, and the signs in the skies served as guides for planting, harvesting, and traveling. Even Easter was determined by astronomical calculations, the Sunday following the first full moon of spring. Yet even as it was a tolerated and sometimes encouraged form of knowledge, astronomy walked a delicate path. Much of the knowledge about the stars came from non-Christian sources, from Arabs, Greeks, and Jews, from translations of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Islamic texts that treated the sky as a precise and rational machine. Many of these works were preserved in Toledo, Spain, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted for centuries, exchanging knowledge, words, and visions. From there came the great star charts that would reach the hands of European scholars. For a long time, the dominant model was the geocentric system of Ptolemy, where Earth was the center of the universe and all other celestial bodies revolved around it, fixed to crystal spheres. This vision, convenient for Christian theology, also matched the sensory experience of the medieval person. After all, the sky appeared to move, and the earth remained still. But there were voices that began to doubt. that observed too closely, that noticed irregularities in the movement of the planets, that dared to ask questions, and with those questions came the fear of heresy, because between astronomy and astrology there was only a thin line, and that line was often crossed. Astrology was viewed with ambiguity by the Church. On one hand, it was condemned as superstition. On the other, it was practiced discreetly by many priests and bishops. Horoscopes were not just for amusement. They were used to predict the future of kings, to select coronation dates, to explain defeats and victories. Many nobles had personal astrologers. Many monks drew natal charts. It was hidden knowledge within the faith. The figure of the medieval astrologer was not so different from that of the alchemist. They worked in silence, with calculations, charts, scrolls. They read the sky as if it were a book, and based on the positions of the stars, they made predictions that influenced important decisions, but always with caution, always with the certainty that a mistake could lead to accusations of witchcraft, or worse, of pride, the gravest of sins, the one that made man believe he could decipher the will of God. Yet medieval astronomy did not stop. Even under suspicion, it continued to grow. It kept drawing the sky, kept calculating eclipses, star paths, seasons, and this slowly accumulated knowledge prepared the way for the great astronomers of the following centuries. For Copernicus, who would place the sun at the center. For Galileo, who would point a telescope at the heavens and declare boldly that there was more above than anyone had ever imagined. Still, at the heart of the Middle Ages, the sky remained sacred, unfathomable, mysterious. It was where dreams lived, where saints resided, where God wrote each night a new story in points of light. And even the simplest peasant, walking home after a long day in the fields, would lift his eyes in silence, because there among the stars was something no one could fully understand, and that, for that very reason, deserved to be respected. Now close your eyes. Imagine a clear sky, cloudless, a scene from medieval fields, no artificial light, only the serene glow of stars, scattered like golden sand across a dark veil. Let that sky wrap around your thoughts, because in every point of light there is an ancient sigh, and in the silent vastness of the universe perhaps the prayers of those who once tried to read God in the constellations still echo. There is something solemn in fire, something that purifies, transforms, frightens and erases. During the Middle Ages and beyond, that fire was not merely a natural element. It was a tool, a spectacle, a sentence. And among the many forms of control that shaped this era, perhaps none was as symbolic, as ritualistic, or as charged with meaning as the pyre that burned bodies, that burned ideas, that burned books, the fire that, invisible flames, declared what could not be spoken aloud. And between the crackling of wood and the muffled screams swallowed by smoke, the world watched the destruction of difference. In this chapter, we walk slowly among the ashes, each step guided by names that defied silence, some known, others forgotten, all marked by the same fate, thinking beyond the frame, in a time when the frame was sacred, immutable, untouchable, because those who questioned the official faith were deemed heretics. Those who dared to challenge dogma were seen as dangerous, and those who proposed a new way of looking at the world often ended wrapped in straw and condemned to the flames. One of the most well-known and most symbolic haunt cases is that of Giordano Bruno, philosopher, mathematician and theologian, born in 1548, but a direct heir of medieval thought. Bruno dared to say that the universe was infinite, that the stars were suns, that other worlds could exist inhabited by other forms of life. He claimed that God was a living presence in all of creation, and that no human institution could contain divine truth. His ideas offended theology, challenged cosmology, and scandalized the Inquisition. He was imprisoned, tortured for 7 years, and in 1600 burned alive in Rome. He died standing, never denying what he believed. His name became a whisper, but his courage echoed through the centuries. Before him, many had already faced the same fate. Jan Hus, a Czech reformer of the 15th century, preached against church abuses, defended communion under both kinds for all believers, and argued that religious authority should be based on scripture, not titles. He was excommunicated, captured during the Council of Constance and burned alive in 1415. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine River, yet decades later, his ideas would be taken up by Luther, another man who nearly met the same fire. And it wasn't only theologians. Many scientists, thinkers, translators, and even ordinary peasants were accused of heresy for spreading ideas considered dangerous. Michael Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian, questioned the doctrine of the Trinity and developed theories about blood circulation. He was condemned by both the Catholic Church and Protestant reformers. He was imprisoned, tortured, and burned in Geneva in 1553. His ideas would later help shape modern medicine. There were also those who were burned without names, without records, without defense. Women accused of witchcraft, converted Jews who maintained secret rituals, men who dreamed too much, young people who read too much, elders who knew too much. Some didn't even know why they were accused. They were simply taken, accused, condemned, and turned into smoke before a crowd that watched with fear, with relief, with indifference, because the pyre was not only punishment, it was a warning, a spectacle, a doctrine set ablaze. And amid all of it, silence, the silence of survivors, the silence of children who lost their parents, the silence of ideas that never blossomed, the silence of burned books. Because yes, books burned too, in squares, in monasteries, in universities, ancient manuscripts, translations of Aristotle, Hebrew codices, pages handwritten over years, reduced to ash in hours. When a body is burned, a life is lost. When a book is burned, a world is lost. Today, as we look back, it is hard to imagine, hard to accept, but necessary to remember, because those who were burned, those who were silenced, those who disappeared in smoke, still echo, still seek a voice, still inhabit our dreams. Their names may have been erased from records, but not from the memory of history. And tonight, as we walk through the remains of time, we pause for a moment and light a candle, not to feed the fire of fear, but to illuminate the ashes of what once was. Now close your eyes. Feel the warmth of the flame, but without haste. Just the warmth. Imagine an empty square, worn stones, and the smell of damp wood beginning to burn. Hear the whisper of the wind, speaking names no one says anymore, because even what was erased still burns in memory. Imagine a vast landscape covered with rolling fields, distant forests, and small houses made of clay and wood scattered around an immense stone castle atop a hill. This silent, fixed image is not merely a setting. It is the perfect portrait of a system that defined the Middle Ages. Feudalism, a social, political, and economic model based on land, loyalty, and dependence, and one that endured virtually unchanged for more than 1,000 years. A massive pyramid supported by millions of anonymous men and women who were born and died in their places, never dreaming of climbing a single step. Feudalism was born from the collapse of the Roman world and the insecurity that spread across Europe in the early Middle Ages. With the fall of cities and the end of central authority, people began to seek protection from those who could offer shelter, food, and safety. That protection came from feudal lords, noble landowners who provided military security in exchange for obedience and labor. It was a silent but definitive exchange. The peasant gave up freedom in the name of survival, and the lord offered his sword in the name of power. Feudal society was structured like a pyramid of personal bonds. At the top, the king, a symbolic figure, often with little real power, but still respected. Below him, the great lords, dukes, counts, barons, who controlled vast fiefs. Beneath them, the vassals, knights and lesser nobles who swore loyalty in exchange for land or support. And at the base of the pyramid, the serfs, peasants who worked the land in exchange for protection. Land was the only wealth, and everything revolved around it. Those who owned it commanded. Those who cultivated it obeyed. The serf was not a slave, but neither was he free. He was born bound to the land. He could not leave it without permission. He owed the lord a portion of his harvest, fixed tributes, days of unpaid labor, and total obedience. He paid to use the mill, to cross the bridge, to sell at the market. Every act of life was mediated by obligations. In return, he received protection from thieves, from invasions, from hunger, at least in theory, because in practice the serf lived in precarity, with little food, little rest, and almost no hope of change. The Lord's castle was more than a home. It was a symbol of power. It was a fortress, a court, a storehouse, a prison. From its windows the Lord watched the fields, the serfs, the horizon. Inside, banquets were held, political decisions made, and trials conducted. The Lord had authority over everything that happened on his lands. He owned lives, destinies, futures. His children inherited the fief. His orders were law, and his power came from two pillars: noble blood and the blessing of the church. For the church was also an essential part of feudalism. Bishops and abbots were feudal lords. They controlled lands, collected tithes, commanded armies. Faith was used to justify inequality. It was said that God had determined the roles of each person. The clergy prayed, the nobles fought, and the serfs worked. It was a sacred order. To question this structure was to question divine will, and that, in the Middle Ages, was unthinkable. Even so, life within the fief followed its own rhythms. There were harvests, religious festivals, community weddings. The serfs helped one another, shared tools, created bonds. Children played among the fields, even knowing they would soon be called to work. Women cared for the home, the children, the herbs, the chickens, and every Sunday all went to Mass, where the priest reinforced the idea that suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven. Resignation was taught as a virtue, and hope as obedience. Feudalism lasted so long because it was stable, because it kept everyone in their place, because it offered security in a world of uncertainty, but also because it smothered any possibility of change. There were revolts, yes, peasants who rebelled, who fled, who looted castles, but they were quickly crushed because the lords had weapons and the church words, and both were merciless. As the centuries passed, the system began to crumble. Cities re-emerged, trade returned. New social groups, such as the bourgeoisie, began to accumulate power without depending on land. But that came later. For centuries, medieval life was above all feudal, marked by obedience, repetition, and permanence. A motionless world where time did not pass. It simply repeated itself. Now close your eyes. Imagine the distant sound of a bell ringing from the top of a castle. See the golden fields stretching as far as the eye can see, and among them, tiny moving dots. Men and women harvesting wheat, carrying baskets, tilling the soil. They have no names, but they were the ones who sustained everything. Because without the serfs there would be no castle, no king, no history. For many centuries, medieval life was rural. The countryside ruled everything. Villages revolved around castles, monasteries, and farmlands. Land was the center, time was cyclical, and change was nearly non-existent. But little by little, like seeds silently germinating beneath damp soil, cities began to bloom once more. Not as we know them today, but as small clusters of houses, tents, workshops, and markets, as hubs of exchange, as points of passage, as glimpses of a future that had no name yet, but was already breathing. This urban rebirth did not happen all at once. It was a slow, scattered, uneven process. It began in strategic locations, crossroads, riverbanks, near castles and monasteries. There travelers would stop, merchants would gather, pilgrims would rest, and gradually stalls became sheds, sheds became streets, streets became neighborhoods, and thus medieval cities were born, spaces of encounter, of conflict, of promise. The first cities of the Middle Ages were not beautiful. They were dense, disorganized, labyrinthine. Narrow, crooked streets filled with mud, waste, and loose animals. Houses were built side by side, often made of wood, with upper floors jutting out over the road. On the ground, sewage ran in the open. The smell was strong, the dust constant. But there was something there that did not exist in the countryside. Movement. People arriving, people leaving, people selling, buying, arguing, preaching. People alive. Commerce was the soul of these cities. Merchants of textiles, wines, spices, salt, tools, grains, furs, oil. Markets became weekly events. Fairs were held on special dates and attracted people from afar. And with trade came the accumulation of wealth. The first rudimentary banks appeared, along with bills of exchange and accounting practices. And with all that, a new class was born, the bourgeoisie. They were not nobles, They were not serfs. They were artisans, merchants, workshop owners, members of trade guilds. They were free men, and that freedom disturbed the feudal lords. To protect their interests, the bourgeois organized. They formed guilds, associations that regulated crafts, set prices, trained apprentices, and maintained product quality. The guilds were at once unions, schools, and courts, and they granted prestige to their members. A respected shoemaker, for example, could grow wealthy, marry well, educate his children. Something unthinkable in the countryside, cities at last offered social mobility, still limited, still difficult, but real. And along with wealth and labor came ideas. Cities became centers of thought, debate, confrontation. Universities began to emerge, the first in Bologna in the 11th century, then Paris, Oxford, Salamanca. They were linked to the church, but also open to reason. There, theology was studied, yes, but also law, medicine, and philosophy. And in those cold halls with torches lit and whispering voices, the ancient world began to breathe again. The texts of Aristotle, the commentaries of Avicenna, the translations of Averroes, the past returning through the east, the future being born in the west. But cities also had their shadows. Inequality was stark. Poor neighborhoods existed side by side with houses of stone and glass. Disease spread easily. Rats, fleas, sewage. Epidemics swept through entire streets. The Black Death in the 14th century found in cities the perfect ground for its fury. And still, cities did not die. They rebuilt. They strengthened. They learned. They resisted. Because the medieval urban spirit was restless and no longer fit within the rigidity of feudalism. The church, in turn, saw in the cities a new battlefield. It built immense cathedrals. It organized mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans, who preached among the poor, walked through the streets and listened to the people's pain. It was a new form of presence and control, because cities with their growing freedom, their books, their debates, represented a risk. And in the Middle Ages, every novelty was closely watched. Even so, nothing stopped the urban advance. From villages came boroughs, from boroughs came walled cities, from cities came more complex kingdoms, and at the heart of this transformation were the men and women who dared to live outside the land, who preferred the noise of the streets to the silence of the fields, who chose the uncertainty of freedom over the stability of servitude. Today, as we stroll through the streets of old cities, often touristy, clean, restored, we may not imagine what once pulsed there. The sweat, the blood, the fever, the cries, the bells. Real life, intense, chaotic. But the history is there, in the stones, in the arches, in the names, because it was in medieval cities that the world began, slowly, to move again. Now close your eyes, feel hurried footsteps over cobblestone streets, hear the sound of mingled voices in the market. Smell the scent of bread baking in open ovens, because in the cities, even amid fear and chaos, there was a promise that the future didn't always have to look like the past. It was night in the cloisters. The cold stones of the floor reflected the yellowish light of a solitary candle. In a small study cell, a young man bent over a manuscript. His hands, trembling from exhaustion, held the quill. His eyes moved across lines written in Latin, copied from an ancient codex. He read in silence, but inside his mind 1,000 ideas stirred. In that gesture, so simple, so routine, a revolution was hidden. Because in the Middle Ages, learning was dangerous, and those who dared to think, to translate, to compare, to disagree, had to do so with faith but also with courage. Medieval universities were born in a time when knowledge was a privilege, books were rare, and independent thought could be mistaken for heresy. And yet, they emerged. Small at first, fragile, dependent on the church and on princes, but with an immense ambition to bring back thought, to organize knowledge, to form men capable of reading, interpreting, arguing, and little by little to rekindle the flame of reason in a world still dominated by absolute faith. The first recognized university in Europe appeared in Bologna at the end of the 11th century, dedicated to the study of Roman law. It was an attempt to reconstruct the ancient legal logic buried since the fall of Rome. Then came Paris, a center of theological knowledge, where not only the Bible was studied, but also Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, Oxford, Cambridge, Salamanca, Heidelberg. Others would follow, forming a growing network of learning that began to breathe again, albeit with difficulty. But universities were not like today's. There were no massive buildings or accessible libraries. Classes took place in monasteries, churches, rented halls. The teachers were called masters, and the students scholars came from various parts of Europe, often with little money, much hunger, and a burning desire to learn. Classes were taught in Latin, books were copied by hand, and the curriculum was rigid. The trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. After that came the higher courses, theology, law, medicine. Knowledge was always filtered through doctrine. Studying was above all confirming the faith, but there were cracks, there were bold masters, there were forbidden readings that circulated in secret, there were translations of Arabic and Jewish texts that brought new, disturbing, subversive ideas. Many of these works came from the schools of Al-Andalus, where Greco-Roman knowledge had been preserved by Muslims. When these ideas entered Christian universities, they caused astonishment and fascination. It was in this environment that figures like Thomas Aquinas emerged, who tried to reconcile Aristotle with Christian faith, creating a powerful synthesis between reason and revelation. Or Peter Abelard, who dared to love a woman, teach dialectics, and challenge authorities. Or Roger Bacon, who dreamed of experimental science and was therefore watched and silenced. These men, and a few women, laid the foundations of a new world, even while still bound to the structure of the old. Studying was a privilege, but also a risk. Books were expensive, rare, fragile. Many could only be read in locked rooms. Copying a single volume could take months, even years. Students slept on hard beds, endured the cold, faced illness. But they persisted, because they knew that knowledge was freedom. And even when the Inquisition roamed the cloisters, even when inquisitors asked too many questions, the manuscripts kept passing from hand to hand, wrapped in cloth, hidden in satchels, copied by candlelight. Medieval universities were also centers of conflict. There were student strikes, public debates, theological clashes. In Paris, masters rebelled against the bishop. In Oxford, students were expelled for refusing to follow royal orders. Knowledge was untamable, and the more one tried to control it, the more it grew, like water slipping through fingers. And it was there, in those stone corridors, among debates and prayers, that the world began to change. Thought regained its value. Questions began to be asked again. Knowledge, even under surveillance, began to expand. And when the Renaissance arrived in the 15th century, with its artists, scientists, and thinkers, it found fertile ground, because the monks and masters of the Middle Ages had prepared the way. Today, when we enter a library, when we open a book, when we study freely, we rarely remember them. But every page written, every idea debated, every school built, all of it has deep roots in the cold nights of medieval universities, where studying was more than learning. It was resistance. Now close your eyes. Hear the soft sound of quills sliding across parchment. Smell the leather, the wax, the ink. Imagine a dark room where a master speaks and dozens of students listen in silence. Because in that room, between candles and words, the ancient world breathed once more, and the future had already begun to be born. The wind blew through the empty streets. The windows were shut. The church bells silent. There were no voices, no laughter, only the hurried footsteps of hooded men, pulling carts filled with bodies. The city, once alive with the buzz of markets, with children running through alleys, with preachers chanting hymns, was now a shadow thick with the scent of death, of mourning, and of despair. That was the Black Death, also known as the Great Plague, the most devastating tragedy of medieval history. Between the years 1347 and 1353, the plague ravaged Europe with a fury bordering on the mythological. In just 6 years, it killed between 25 and 50 million people, roughly 1/3 to half of the European population. It was a swift, silent, incomprehensible death. The symptoms began with high fever, vomiting, intense joint pain. Then came the swellings, the buboes, dark and painful, which gave the disease its name, bubonic plague. And finally, the body became covered in black patches and silence. In just a few days, the victim would die. There was no cure, no escape, only fear. A fear that spread as fast as the disease itself. The plague reached Europe through the Mediterranean ports. Ships arriving from the east carried goods and rats. Rats infested with fleas carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium. These rats spread through the overcrowded, filthy, suffocating cities, and the disease found fertile ground. From Genoa to Marseille, from Paris to London, from Lisbon to Prague, no city was spared, and no village remained untouched for long, because death traveled in the footsteps of merchants, on the winds of trade, in handshakes, in farewell embraces. The devastation was not just physical, it was spiritual. People could not comprehend what was happening. In the medieval worldview, all illness was a divine punishment. But why such fury? Why so many children? So many mothers? So many priests? The churches, once places of refuge, became scenes of panic. The bells announcing the dead never stopped ringing. Cemeteries filled up. Mass graves were dug. Priests refused to give last rites. Monasteries shut their doors. The people felt abandoned, not just by society, but by God. And so, trust in the church began to crack. For the clergy, who for centuries had promised spiritual protection, now also fell ill. They died. Bishops fled. Monks fell silent. And people began to ask, if the men of God are dying too, then who can save us? Extreme reactions arose. Some gave in to unrestrained pleasure, to drunkenness, to lust, since death seemed inevitable. Others joined penitential groups like the Flagellants, who walked from city to city, whipping themselves, begging forgiveness for sins no one could name. There were also persecutions. Minorities, especially Jews, were accused of poisoning wells, of causing the plague. Thousands were murdered. Pain, when misunderstood, always seeks someone to blame. In the cities, the economy collapsed. Workshops closed. Farms were abandoned. There was no one to harvest wheat, slaughter cattle, or care for the sick. Famine followed soon after, and with it, violence. Entire families vanished. Estates were left without heirs. The structures of feudalism began to weaken. For the first time in centuries, labor became scarce, and the laborer valuable. This would change the social fabric of Europe forever. And yet, the plague also sparked reflection. Art began to portray death more directly. Macabre dances appeared, along with skulls, poems about the end. Philosophy turned towards suffering, and medical knowledge began to reorganize. Although the real cause of the plague was still unknown, thinkers began to question old dogmas. The need to understand and not merely to pray began to grow. The seed of the Renaissance was planted in the funerary soil of the Middle Ages. Still, the pain lingered. For years, decades, centuries. In many places, streets are still called Cemetery Lane, Death Alley, or Hangman's Road, names dating back to that dark time. And in many families, surnames vanished, erased by the disease. The plague would return in smaller waves, but none as devastating as that first one. Today, when we remember the Black Death, we should not only count the dead, we must listen to the silences, the sound of locked doors, the muffled crying, the final breath of a father, a mother, a child, the unanswered prayer, the hope turned to ash, because there, among the screams and the sobs, the Middle Ages changed forever. Now close your eyes, feel the cold air drifting through empty streets, see the candles in windows, hear the distant bell tolling alone, and understand, even in the darkest night, even in the deepest sorrow, history moved on, because there is always a tomorrow, even when it rises from the ruins. It was the year 1095. In Clermont, France, a man with a powerful voice, Pope Urban II, rose before a crowd and, with fiery words, summoned the faithful of Christendom to a sacred mission, to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Pope's words echoed like thunder through the heart of Europe. He promised eternal salvation to all who departed in the name of the cross. He said those who died on this mission would not pass through purgatory. He said it was God who called, and thousands of men listened. Poor men, noblemen, peasants, knights, widowers, thieves, orphans, all suddenly became armed pilgrims. Thus were born the Crusades, one of the most complex, contradictory, and violent phenomena of the Middle Ages. The Crusades were military expeditions driven by religious motives, organized by the church and supported by kings, princes, and lords. Their stated goal was to reconquer the so-called holy places, especially Jerusalem, which were under the control of various Muslim empires. But behind the faith, other interests loomed. trade routes, land, political power, personal glory. The East fascinated. The wealth of the Islamic world, with its palaces, libraries, fine fabrics and spices, stirred European greed. And so, with crosses stitched into their tunics and whispered prayers between clenched teeth, multitudes set out on long, dangerous and often fatal marches. The First Crusade, 1096-1099, was marked by brutality and military success. After an exhausting journey through Europe and the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, and when they took the city, they made no distinction between combatants and civilians. Muslims, Jews, women, children, all were massacred. The streets, according to chronicles, ran red with blood, but for the Crusaders it was a victory of faith. They had taken the holy city, they had done the impossible, they had fulfilled the promise, and so they knelt amid the rubble. Praying after killing was part of the ritual. In the centuries that followed, more crusades ensued. There were 9 major military campaigns, along with dozens of smaller expeditions. Some succeeded, others failed disastrously. There were crusades led by kings, like Richard the Lionheart of England. There were crusades of children, who never reached their destination. There were betrayals, such as the Fourth Crusade, in which Christians, instead of fighting Muslims, invaded and looted Constantinople, a Christian city, destroying churches, stealing relics, and burning libraries. Faith gave way to gold, and the cross often was nothing more than a banner of conquest. Meanwhile, Muslims resisted. Led by figures like Saladin, they managed to retake Jerusalem and reclaim many territories. Saladin, unlike many crusaders, became known for his tolerance and honor. He allowed Christians to leave Jerusalem safely. He protected sacred sites of other religions. His stance contrasted with the ferocity of the Western invaders, and to this day, his image remains a symbol of dignity amid war. The Crusades also deeply impacted life in Europe. Those who returned, the few who survived, brought not only scars but novelties, scientific knowledge, Arabic words, navigational tools, exotic flavors. Islamic medicine influenced European practices. Mathematics, with its numerals, opened new doors. Contact with other cultures broadened horizons, but it also reinforced prejudice. The East came to be seen with admiration and fear, with respect and hatred. Intolerance grew, and the world became even more divided. And we must not forget the internal crusades. The Albigensian Crusade, for instance, was not waged against Muslims but against Christians deemed heretics, the Cathars, in southern France. They were exterminated with the same violence, in the name of the same faith. Because once the cross had become a sword, it chose no targets. Any difference was a threat. In the end, the outcome was ambiguous. Jerusalem was taken, lost, retaken, and lost again. Thousands of lives were lost. Entire peoples were displaced, and faith, such a profound force, was used as justification for destruction. Still, for many, the Crusades were the pinnacle of their existence, a purpose, a mission, a calling. And to this day, their echoes remain in the memories of peoples, in the stones of fortresses, in street names, in sacred books. Now close your eyes. Picture a crowd marching through a desert, holding spears and rosaries. Hear the chants mingled with the clatter of armor. Feel the grit of sand in your eyes, the sun pressing against leather. And understand, not all faith brings light. Sometimes faith burns. Sometimes faith kills. And even so, even among swords and screams, there were those who still looked up to the sky and prayed in silence, hoping that one day the cross would return to being just a cross. Imagine the sound of wooden wheels creaking on iron tracks, the muffled breath of a locomotive slicing through fields once plowed by oxen. The sky, once clear and open, now grey, cloaked in columns of smoke rising from towering chimneys, scattered among red brick buildings with small windows. The church bells no longer mark time. Now it's the factory clock that rules life. Thus begins the end of the medieval world, not with thunder, but with steam, with coal, with gears, with sweat, and with the Industrial Revolution, which subtly, and later violently, unraveled the fabric of the Middle Ages. Feudalism, which for centuries organized Europe around the land, had begun to give way as early as the 14th century. The Black Death had decimated the population, profoundly altering the relationship between lords and serfs. The rise of cities, the expansion of trade, the strengthening of monarchies and the bourgeoisie, all of it signaled that the old time was unraveling. But it was only with the steam engine in the late 18th century that the old medieval world truly began to vanish. The Industrial Revolution began in England, a country with very specific conditions: access to coal and iron, capital accumulated from colonies, an entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, and a political structure that favored innovation. There, the first textile factories replaced artisans and manual workshops. In no time, machines were doing in hours what once took days, weeks, even months. Mass production was born, and with it, a new class of workers, the urban proletariat. These workers didn't live in fields or feudal estates. They lived in industrial cities, in poor neighborhoods, in precarious housing near the factories. The workday was long, 14, 16 hours a day. Men, women, and children. Yes, children. Some as young as 5 or 6, working in coal mines around dangerous gears, breathing in smoke. Child labor, which had already existed in rural areas, now took on a mechanical and relentless pace. Wages were miserable, accidents frequent, and life disposable. What was once community became crowd. What was once the rhythm of nature became the rhythm of machines. What was once countryside became concrete, soot, sirens. The Industrial Revolution brought advancement, but also dehumanization. It brought progress, but also exclusion. And the church, which had been the center of social life throughout the Middle Ages, saw its power diminish. Science, technology, money, and production now stood at the altar of the modern world. Knowledge also changed. It was no longer confined to monasteries and theological universities. It now served industry. Chemistry created dyes and explosives. Physics designed locomotives. Biology helped understand the epidemics plaguing industrial cities. Knowledge became a practical tool, and the old handwritten books gave way to pamphlets, manuals, newspapers. Gutenberg's printing press, invented back in the 15th century, now became a weapon of the bourgeoisie. The printed word moved ideas, parties, revolutions, and so the medieval world died in silence. Castles emptied. Monasteries turned into schools or storage. Villages were abandoned by young people in search of factory jobs. Land was no longer everything. Capital now ruled. The nobleman, once master of all, lost ground to the entrepreneur. The peasant became a proletarian. The wheel of time spun faster, and the old feudal clock no longer told the hours. But not everything disappeared. Much of what was medieval still remains, hidden, transformed. In churches, we still ring bells. In courts, we still follow ancient rituals. In the countryside, we still celebrate festivals that reach far into the past. The Middle Ages didn't end all at once. It dissolved, slowly, like mist fading at sunrise. And when the modern world awakened with its lights, its factories, its tracks, there was still dust from the old world in the eyes of those who witnessed the change. Now close your eyes. Hear the distant beat of a machine, pulsing in steady rhythm. See the smoke rising thick in the grey sky of an industrial city. And for a moment, imagine someone born on a feudal field, dying in a factory. Someone who saw the world change before their eyes and had no time to understand what was happening. Because the end of the Middle Ages was not an event. It was a process, long, complex, human. And now here calmly we understand it. While kings signed treaties and bishops decided the course of faith, the people lived. And to live in the Middle Ages was a silent and constant act, made of small gestures repeated day after day. It meant waking up to the sound of a rooster, lighting the fire with dry twigs, preparing thick rye bread, feeding the chickens, and heading to the fields with bare hands. It meant carrying water in wooden buckets, sewing by candlelight, braiding herbs into a daughter's hair, and reciting prayers to ward off the evil eye. Everyday medieval life, far from wars and pyres, was built on simple habits, deep beliefs, and seasonal celebrations. At the heart of the village, customs guided existence with firmness. There were no modern choices. The way one ate, dressed, named children, and prayed all followed tradition inherited over centuries. Meals were almost always the same: bread, soup, porridge, cabbage, cheese, and rarely meat. Barley and wheat sustained the body, and weak beer, known as table beer, was served even to children. Utensils, when present, were simple: Food was shared from communal bowls with hands or wooden spoons. Clothing, too, followed ritual. The poor wore garments of wool, raw linen or hemp, dyed with roots and flowers. Bright colors were a luxury. Baths were rare but not non-existent. In some regions, people washed in rivers or wooden barrels. They used homemade soaps made from animal fat and ashes. Fragrance came from herbs, rosemary, lavender, mint. But some believed that bathing opened the pores to disease, and so many avoided it. Everything stood between the practical and the mystical, and between one harvest and the next came the festivals. Ah, the festivals. They were the moments when work paused and joy slipped through the hardened fingers of routine. Each season had its celebration. Spring brought fertility rites. Summer, harvest feasts. Autumn, expressions of thanks. Winter, prayers against cold and darkness. The calendar was indeed Christian, full of saints, masses and processions. But beneath every celebration lay pagan roots. The summer solstice, for example, was celebrated with bonfires, dances and songs older than Christianity. Christmas blended with the ancient cult of the sun's rebirth. Easter with old fertility festivals. At the fairs, music played from flutes, fiddles, drums. Men danced arm in arm. Women spun in colorful skirts. Jugglers, potion vendors and street performers delighted onlookers. Children ran between stalls, eating dried apples and honeyed bread. In these moments, life felt light, fear slept, and the community recognized itself as a living body. But along with customs and celebrations came superstitions. Ah, they were everywhere. The medieval world was magical by definition. Every illness had a spiritual cause. Every natural event was a sign. A sudden thunderclap could mean divine punishment. A crow at the window, a bad omen. A wart on the left foot, a crossing with the other world. People lived surrounded by symbols. They wore iron amulets, animal teeth, wooden crosses, blessed branches. It wasn't blind faith, and it was folk knowledge, a way to protect oneself in a world always on the brink of the invisible. Women, especially the older ones, were guardians of these beliefs. They knew the right words to ward off evil, the prayers to soothe babies, the teas to reduce fever, the gestures to cure the evil eye. Men respected and feared them, for a woman who knew too much could be seen as a witch. So this knowledge passed discreetly from mother to daughter, like secrets whispered by the fire. Death, finally, was part of daily life. There was no illusion. People knew life was brief, and so they lived with quiet intensity, with care, with resignation, with faith. The dead were mourned at home, wrapped in white cloths. Children were taught to respect cemeteries, to pray for ancestors, not to play near graves. It was a peaceful coexistence with the end, without denial, without haste. And so people lived in the Middle Ages, between bread and prayer, between drum and cross, between harvest and fear. It was not a time of total darkness, nor of full light. It was a time of human beings, real, imperfect, hopeful. A time when laughter arose even in the mud, when faith walked hand in hand with superstition, and when tomorrow was always a gift, never a certainty. Now close your eyes. Hear the crackle of a fire. Smell herbs burning in the air, and imagine a village at dusk with mothers calling their children, elders telling stories, and a distant bell ringing slowly, calling to prayer. Because there, in the simple gestures of each day, the Middle Ages lived and survived. In the dim light of a small chapel, hidden among hills and wrapped in silent mist, a single candle flickered before a silver reliquary. Inside it, wrapped in silk, rested something minuscule, perhaps a tooth, perhaps a bone fragment, perhaps a sliver of wood that once belonged to the cross of Christ. And before that object, men and women knelt with tears in their eyes, with promises on their lips, with hope in their hearts. Because for the medieval man, God was not a distant idea. He was there, present, tangible, embodied in things, and those things they called relics carried a power that surpassed reason and entered directly into the realm of the sacred. In the Middle Ages, relics were the heart of Christian mysticism, small remains of saints, martyrs, apostles, or objects that, according to tradition, had touched Christ's body. A strand of Mary's hair, a piece of St. Francis's tunic, a bone from St. Catherine's hand, the tip of the nail that pierced Jesus, a vial containing drops of the Virgin's milk. The belief in their authenticity was often questionable, but that mattered little. because the power lay not only in the object, but in the faith it inspired. These relics were not hidden. They were displayed in golden reliquaries on special altars in processions. Many churches competed over who possessed the most powerful, the most miraculous, the most pure. Some cities built entire cathedrals to house a single relic, like Chartres, which held the Virgin's veil, or Cologne, which claimed to possess the bones of the 3 wise men. And the faithful came from afar. They came on pilgrimages that lasted months. They came barefoot, hungry, exhausted, but full of faith, because they believed that object could heal, forgive, transform. And it wasn't just the relic that moved the crowds. It was the miracles, the stories of healing, of lights in the sky, of statues that wept, of saints appearing in dreams, saving villages from plague, curing the blind. It was a time when the extraordinary was not an exception. It was part of life. Medieval faith was sensory. It was body, it was skin, it was touch. People didn't want to merely believe. They wanted to see, to hear, to feel. That's why they kissed altars, touched images, slept beside tombs, prayed beside bones. Pilgrimage was one of the greatest acts of faith. To go to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem, to walk for weeks, months, through sun, rain, snow, to carry guilt, sins, illnesses, hopes, to stop in villages, hear stories, trade bread for shelter. It was more than a journey, it was transformation. Many didn't return. They died on the way. But those who did came back, changed, as if something had left them along the path, and something greater had taken its place. Medieval mysticism also expressed itself in less visible ways. Visions, ecstasies, revelations. Many monks and nuns claimed to see angels, to hear voices, to receive divine messages. Some were respected, others watched. Because the line between miracle and heresy was thin, there were saints canonized for their miracles, but there were also mystics who ended up imprisoned. Faith was celebrated, but also surveilled. Even so, the longing for the sacred did not cease. It was stronger than fear. In homes, the sacred was present too. Small altars with images of saints, blessed branches on doors, candles lit to ward off evil spirits, crosses made from olive branches, medals around the neck, and prayers, so many prayers, for children's health, for the harvest, against thunder, against plague, for the souls of the dead. Medieval daily life was intertwined with the invisible. Everything had a mystical explanation. Everything was a sign. A dream could be a warning, a pain, a punishment, an unexpected smile, a blessing. Over time, the power of relics and miracles grew so much that they became tools of politics. Kings fought over saints' remains. Popes used miracles to strengthen their prestige. Monks sold fragments of the true cross, even if enough wood circulated in Europe to build a bridge. Faith was deep, but also manipulable, and the people often had no way to tell where miracle ended and deception began. Still, they believed, because faith offered meaning. And in that time, meaning was all one could hold on to in the face of suffering. Today, when we walk into old churches, we often don't even notice. But there, beneath the altar, there may be a reliquary, a piece of history, a fragment of bone, a tooth, a drop of something that once was a tear, blood, sweat, a remnant of the hope of thousands who, centuries ago, knelt on that same ground, prayed, promised, believed. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the scent of incense burning slowly. See the colored light filtering through stained glass. Hear the footsteps of pilgrims entering the church, tired but full of heart, because for them, in that tiny object, dwelled the divine, and in that simple faith dwelled the courage to keep going. From a distance, the throne looked majestic, elevated, surrounded by tapestries, lit by colorful stained glass windows that painted sacred shadows on the floor. A carved wooden seat adorned with symbols, coats of arms, and crosses. But if we looked closely, we would see that it was not comfortable. It was hard, cold, and above all, heavy. Because the throne didn't just support a body, it bore centuries of tradition, expectations, secret pacts, broken alliances, and promises that could not be undone. To be a king or queen in the Middle Ages was to live between the sword and the altar. It was to wear a crown that could shine or wound. Throughout the medieval centuries, kings and queens were more than rulers. They were seen as chosen by God. Monarchy was not merely political, it was sacred. Power came from above. The royal anointing, performed with holy oils, transformed the sovereign into something almost divine. He was called the Lord's Anointed, and thus disobeying the king was often considered a sin. But the king also owed obedience to the church, to bishops, to popes, so the crown shared space with the mitre, and governance with the confessional. Life in the palace was marked by ritual. Everything had form, rule, ceremony. The king's rising was observed by dozens of eyes. The gesture of sitting, the way he held a goblet, the words he spoke to the queen, everything was scrutinized, because the court was a stage of power, and where there is a stage there are actors, advisors, nobles, foreign envoys, servants, monks, generals, heirs, lovers, each with their own interests, each with their own web of information, each ready to serve or betray. Medieval power was built on strategic silences, and the corridors of castles heard far more than was spoken. And there were the queens, often treated as decorative figures, but who, behind the scenes, moved pieces with great skill. They wove alliances with words, influenced heirs, counseled the king, protected the lineage's interests. Some queens truly ruled, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who navigated reigns, crusades, and marriages with sharp intelligence and an authority no man dared ignore. Others, however, were locked away, silenced, accused of witchcraft, exchanged for better alliances. Medieval politics was an unstable chessboard. Kingdoms rose and fell through marriage. Peace treaties were sealed with forced unions. Wars started over inheritances, insults, rumors. Brothers killed brothers. Fathers disinherited sons. Queens poisoned rivals. And the people, watching from afar, could do little. When a new king was crowned, cities celebrated. But the peasant's life didn't change. It remained the same, with or without a throne, because power was far above, and the people always on the margins. But kings were not invincible. Many went mad. Others were assassinated. Some became legends. Others forgotten. There were saintly kings like Louis IX of France, who carried thorns from Christ's crown and built chapels like jewels. There were tyrant kings like John of England, hated even by his own barons. There were devout queens and dangerous ones. Power never came alone. It always brought the shadow of fear and loneliness. And between the crown and the cross stood the Pope. In Rome, the pontiff watched, advised, judged. Sometimes he blessed, sometimes he excommunicated. A king could conquer territories, but if he was excommunicated, he lost everything. His authority vanished like dust. That's why many kings kissed the Pope's feet, as Henry IV did before Gregory VII, kneeling in the snow, begging for forgiveness. Because in the Middle Ages, politics was as spiritual as it was carnal, and the throne as sacred as it was vulnerable. Today, when we see portraits of kings with gleaming crowns, surrounded by swords and scepters, it's easy to imagine them as powerful, nearly untouchable. But beneath the armor was flesh. There was fear. There were doubts. Sleepless nights. Because the medieval king was not master of himself. He was a prisoner of the throne. And the queen was often just another piece in a game she knew, but rarely could win. Now close your eyes. Imagine the echo of footsteps in a stone hall, the whisper of candles lit before a coronation, the sound of a harp playing in the background while counselors discuss a treaty. And there, high above, seated on a majestic throne, a king, motionless, surrounded by watchful eyes, clad in gold, and in his chest, a human heart. Because even wrapped in pomp, medieval power was made of flesh, of blood, and of silence. In the mist of medieval time, women emerge as shadows bearing the weight of the world, even when the books forget them. In official iconography, they appear as the Virgin Mary, obedient queens, or silent martyrs. But beneath this symbolic surface, there were millions of other women, midwives who dealt with life and death, peasant women who rose before the sun, healers who learned the power of herbs, nuns who copied sacred texts, wives who buried children without tears, and warriors who silently took up arms. Female life in the Middle Ages was shaped by roles that could not be refused. To be born a woman was, almost always, to be born with an imposed destiny. In the countryside, she was mother, farmer, caregiver, cook, guardian of domestic life. In the cities, she helped her husband with trade, wove cloth, cooked for dozens, and raised children who often would not survive. Infant mortality was brutal, and every childbirth could be the last. Women were seen as fragile, and yet they carried the world in their arms. Within the church's structure there was space for some. Convents offered shelter, learning, and even power to those who renounced marriage. Many noble daughters were sent to religious orders as children. They became nuns, some even abbesses with authority over vast lands. There they could write, teach, grow herbs, study. But even within these orders, their voices were constantly monitored. Still, figures like Hildegard of Bingen broke through invisible bars and left behind mystical, musical, and medical works that endured for centuries. But there was another extreme: the witches. Women who knew plants, who spoke alone, who lived on the margins. As fear of heresy grew and the church sought to tighten control over popular faith, these women began to be hunted. It wasn't just what they did, it was what they represented. Knowledge that came not from the cross but from the earth. And for that, they were dangerous. One failed harvest, one sick child, one dead cow, and someone would point, it was her. The pyre was lit, and no one dared ask why. At the top of the pyramid were the queens. Some were married at 12 or 13, others, less fortunate, were promised from birth. They became bargaining chips between kingdoms, sealing treaties with their bodies, but that didn't prevent them from influencing. Many ruled on behalf of their sons as regents. Others conspired, advised, commanded armies. Some, like Isabella of Castile or Eleanor of Aquitaine, shaped the fate of entire nations. But even in power they were judged by their fertility, appearance, obedience. The crown weighed heavier on them. In the villages, women built rituals. They stitched together faith and superstition. They taught daughters to pray, to give birth, to fear, to be silent. Knowledge was passed through stories, through gestures. There were no books, there was memory, and there was silence. Because for many, speaking too much was a risk. Being too visible was a threat. The fear of being a witch, of being cursed, of being accused, lingered in the air, and even so they cared for life. Every single day. There was also love. There was desire. There were secrets between coarse linen sheets. There were arranged marriages, but also forbidden loves. Women who dared to love beyond expectation, who fled with knights, who bore children of clergymen, who died for passion, and others who lived long lives, stitching silence over silence. Because the medieval female heart was as real as any throne, and it beat, even when no one heard it. Today, when we visit an old church, we look at the images of saints with veils and downcast eyes, but we don't see the peasant women who lit candles there for centuries. We don't see the mothers who buried their children there, the widows who prayed there, the girls who ran from the altar, those who were forgotten by history, but not by life, because the Middle Ages were feminine, deeply so. Even if in silence. Now close your eyes. Smell the bread baking in a clay oven. Hear the creaking of floorboards under the tired feet of a mother. And imagine them all, the nuns, the witches, the queens, the peasants, looking up at the night sky and asking for just one thing, that the world one day would hear them. Imagine walking through a medieval village at dusk. The sound of blacksmith hammers begins to fade. The murmur of prayers blends with the clatter of wooden buckets. And in the distance, coming from a tavern lit by torches, a soft, repetitive melody drifts over rooftops like mist. This is how music emerged in the Middle Ages, not as spectacle, but as a constant presence. It wasn't a luxury. It was a tool of connection to the sacred, to love, to work, and to pain. In the church, sounds echoed beneath the high ceilings of cathedrals. Gregorian chant was the music of the invisible. No instruments, no haste, no marked rhythm, just male voices chanting slow Latin syllables as if each word were reaching for the divine. There was no applause, no audience, only silence and faith. Monks learned these chants from a young age. It was part of their spiritual discipline. Music was prayer, and each note was a step toward heaven. But outside the abbeys, music was more colorful. In villages, in fields, during festivals, there were troubadours, minstrels, and jongleurs. They were wandering musicians, traveling with lutes strapped to their backs, flutes hanging from their belts and poetry on their tongues. They sang of forbidden loves, distant battles, miraculous saints, and treacherous kings. Their songs served as news, as soap opera, as escape from routine. In squares, at fairs, in noble feasts, they brought sound where there had been silence. Medieval instruments were varied and full of soul. The lute, similar to a small guitar, whispered love with its strings. The hurdy-gurdy, played with a crank, made sounds like moaning wind. Bagpipes made from animal skins were common at dances and village festivals. The psaltery and harp enchanted noble halls. And in the villages, there were hand drums, rustic flutes, rattles, and even bones clicked together as percussion. Music was made with what people had, and with what they felt. Work songs set the rhythm of the body. While planting, harvesting, washing clothes, or kneading bread, voices joined together to ease fatigue. The words didn't always make sense. Sometimes they were invented sounds, repeated formulas, ancient rhymes. But these songs carried centuries of lived experience. They were the emotional DNA of the villages, and many survive today, hidden in modern folk songs. At religious festivals, music was a mix of devotion and joy. Marches, liturgical chants, regional hymns. Processions were accompanied by deep tones, bell chimes, muffled drums. And in pagan festivals disguised by Christianity, music took on a life of its own. Circle dances, frantic drumming, dissonant notes, female voices that felt ritualistic. The line between the sacred and the mystical was thin, and music passed naturally between the two. Among the nobility, there was courtly music, scholarly, refined, full of symbols. Songs of honor, purity, knights and maidens. Many were written in local tongues like Provençal or Old French. This was music for listening and for thinking. Among peasants, music was body. It was dance. It was escape. In taverns, the songs were bold, comedic, risque. They spoke of drink, betrayal, broken promises, and no one judged, because there everyone needed to laugh a little before life called again at dawn. The sounds of the medieval world didn't come only from instruments. They came from church bells marking the hours, calling to mass, announcing death, from horses' hooves on stone, from wagon wheels creaking, from chants at fairs, from the nuns' litanies, from street boys singing for coins. The Middle Ages were noisy, pulsing, sonorous. Even in monasteries there was the whisper of quills on parchment, the crack of cut wood, the muffled echo of footsteps on cold stone. Today, we can hear replicas of this music in specialty recordings. But the true medieval sound is not on CDs. It lives in the imagination, in the silence of night, in the whistle that escapes unbidden, in the memory of a melody heard long ago in childhood, because that music was made to linger in the air, to enter through the ears and dissolve in the heart. Now close your eyes. Hear the distant sound of a lute. Imagine a village lit by torches, children dancing, women clapping, an old man singing verses he learned from his grandfather. And in the background, the sound of church bells marking bedtime. Because in the Middle Ages, even before dreams, music was already caring for the soul. At the break of dawn, the city gates creak open with ancient groans. One by one, carts arrive from the surrounding villages. Men lead donkeys burdened with sacks of wheat. Women balance baskets of vegetables, and youths carry cheeses wrapped in leaves. The market square, paved with beaten stone, begins to fill with color, scent, and sound. Because in the medieval world, the market was more than a place of purchase. It was the heart of the city. Everything was sold there. Fresh bread, salted meats, smoked fish, dried fruits, butter, wine, eggs, honey, salami, grains, fabrics, soaps, iron tools, rustic shoes, clay jars, tanned leather. The sounds overlapped. The clinking of coins, the cries of vendors, the mooing of oxen, the wailing of children, the loud voices of hagglers. And among all of it, the smell of onions, smoke, roasting pork, manure, and fresh rosemary. In larger cities like Venice, Bruges, Toledo, or Constantinople, trade was international. Shipments arrived from Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. From the legendary Silk Road came fine brocades, porcelain, spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. From African mines came gold and ivory. From the Islamic world came luxury textiles, perfumes, and knowledge, manuscripts, astronomical instruments, medical techniques. And all of it passed through Christian and Muslim hands, through sailors and merchants, pirates and patricians. Globalization already existed, on carts. Land routes were difficult, dangerous, and long. Merchants traveled in caravans protected by armed guards. They spent weeks enduring rain, bandits, disease, and tolls demanded by feudal lords. Every bridge, every forest, every crossroads could be a trap or a blessing, but the risk was worth it. A load of silk or spices could yield fortunes, and the cities that received these goods grew, gained autonomy, and became economic centers. Over time, seasonal fairs emerged. They brought together merchants from various regions and lasted days, sometimes weeks. The Champagne Fair in France was famous. Traders from northern Europe met with Italians and Arabs, exchanging wool for gold, glass for spices. At these fairs, beyond goods, languages, customs, recipes, and legends were exchanged. It was a true collision of worlds. Money was a world of its own. Coins of copper, silver, or gold circulated under many names: florins, maravedis, ducats, deniers. But change wasn't always available. Many transactions happened through barter: a chicken for a pair of sandals, a bunch of onions for a bar of soap. The value of goods varied depending on the seller's mood, the harvest's abundance, or even the number of soldiers in the village. Merchants were ambiguous figures. Some grew rich and earned prestige. Others were viewed with suspicion for dealing with money, something the church often associated with the sin of usury. Even so, the first guilds and trade associations emerged, where cobblers, blacksmiths, tailors, and other craftsmen organized, protected their interests, and set minimum prices. These were the early steps of medieval urban capitalism. But commerce wasn't just the exchange of goods. It was the exchange of ideas. With products came new words, ways of dressing, ways of thinking. Black pepper came from India, but soon seasoned European dishes. Paper, brought from China, and then the Arabs, revolutionized writing. Even the game of chess brought by the Moors began to be played by nobles in silent halls. Markets also offered entertainment: jugglers, musicians, dancers, fortune-tellers, performers of religious plays. Children watched wide-eyed, and adults, between purchases, let themselves be carried away by the fantasy. Because deep down, the market was more than a selling space. It was an open-air theater, a meeting square, a miniature reflection of the medieval world. Today, when we stroll through farmers' markets, street fairs, or historical centers, we still feel, without realizing it, the echo of those ancient times. The spice stall, the vendor shouting prices, the smell of bread from a stone oven. All of it is memory, and all of it has happened centuries ago. Now close your eyes. Imagine a stone square, full of life. See fabrics fluttering in the wind, coins clinking, nervous smiles, bargaining gestures, stubborn donkeys, and children running. And amid all of it, the world turning, not with wars or kings, but with onions, salami, and silk. In the darkest corner of a monastery, a candle burns slowly. On the stone table, flasks, scrolls, scales, and embers sit in silence. And before them, eyes half closed, a man draws symbols with an iron rod, while whispering in Latin words no one else understands. His face is covered in soot, his hands stained with metals. He is not a doctor, nor a priest, nor a sorcerer. He is an alchemist, and he lives between the visible and the invisible, between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. Because for him, turning lead into gold is just the beginning. What he truly seeks is the soul of matter. Medieval alchemy was born from the meeting of ancient Greek knowledge, Egyptian practices, and Arab wisdom. For centuries, alchemists like Zosimos of Panopolis, Avicenna, Geber, and later Albertus Magnus tried to decipher the mysteries of matter. But unlike modern chemistry, alchemy was not merely technique. It was spirituality materialized. Matter had a soul. Fire was not just heat, it was purification. Mercury, sulfur, and salt were more than substances. They were principles of the universe. The greatest alchemical dream was the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance, capable of turning base metals into pure gold, and more than that, capable of granting eternal life. It was believed that, by achieving the stone, the alchemist also reached supreme self-knowledge. It was the perfect union of body and spirit, of heaven and earth. The alchemical process was divided into phases: nigredo, decomposition; albedo, purification; citrinitas, illumination; and rubedo, perfection. Each stage mirrored an inner transformation. In the laboratories, called athanors, alchemists manipulated everything they could: Metals, plants, ashes, stones, fluids. They used rudimentary stills, presses, furnaces, filters, and tubes made of clay or glass. The environment was hot, humid, dark. It smelled of sulfur, alcohol, melted wax. But what guided them was not certainty, it was mystery. With every accidental explosion, with every cracked vial, another question was born. Because in alchemy, error was also a symbol. The church regarded them with suspicion. Some alchemists swore they acted for the glory of God, but others were labeled charlatans. Some were imprisoned, others were burned as heretics. Many believed alchemy defied dogma. That to want to create life or prolong death was to try to take the place of God. Still, the laboratories persisted, hidden in monasteries, in castles, in forests, like temples of doubt. Curiously, alchemy was not exclusive to men. There are records of female alchemists, especially in the Arab and Egyptian traditions. One of the most well-known is Mary the Jewess, said to have invented instruments still used in modern chemistry, like the bain-marie. These women did not seek only the transmutation of metals, but also elixirs, perfumes, cosmetics, medicines, and mixtures with spiritual power. Female alchemy was less about gold and more about healing. The relationship with the stars was also central. Alchemists observed the sky. They believed each metal corresponded to a planet: gold to the sun, silver to the moon, iron to Mars, Mercury to Mercury. Thus, every material experiment had to align with the celestial rhythm, because deep down, everything, absolutely everything, was a cosmic dance, a reflection of the whole. And the alchemist, an imitator of the gods. Today, many see alchemy only as a naive step towards science, but that forgets its symbolic depth. Because for the medieval mind, it wasn't enough to understand the world. One had to transform it, and true transformation began within. The alchemist was at once a scientist, mystic, philosopher, and poet. A solitary figure facing the unknown, in search of an answer that could not be written, only felt. Now close your eyes. Imagine the heat of the furnace, the golden glow emerging from a vial, the sound of bubbling liquid. See the alchemist hunched over, reading an ancient manuscript by candlelight, and listen in the distance to what might be his only certainty, that the universe is not made of matter, but of mystery. Imagine a night sky with no pollution, no lampposts, no artificial light, a deep darkness broken only by the glow of the moon and thousands of stars visible to the naked eye. This was how the world saw the sky during the Middle Ages. And before it, men did not merely admire it, they interpreted it, because the firmament was a book, a prophecy, a clock, a map of divine will. In medieval culture, the sky was not just a set of stars, it was a hierarchical, ordered, sacred structure. According to the worldview inherited from the Greeks and adapted by Christian theologians, the universe was made of concentric spheres. Earth, motionless, stood at the center. Around it revolved the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each in its own sphere. Beyond them was the sphere of fixed stars, and above all, the primum mobile, the first sphere moved by God, setting all the others into motion. This geocentric conception, strengthened by Aristotle and systematized by Claudius Ptolemy, reigned supreme in the Middle Ages. More than a scientific model, it was a metaphor for the cosmos as divine creation. The order of the heavens reflected the order of the earth. Every star had a role. Every planet influenced moods, births, disasters. The sky was read like a celestial manuscript, and medieval astronomers were its careful readers. Inside monasteries and universities, astronomy was taught as part of the 7 liberal arts, belonging to the quadrivium, alongside arithmetic, geometry, and music. Because understanding the cycles of the stars also meant understanding time, the calendar, and religious rituals. The position of the moon determined the date of Easter. The equinoxes guided planting. Eclipses inspired fear and awe. The sky gave structure to life. Instruments such as the astrolabe allowed for calculating celestial positions, measuring the height of stars, and predicting phenomena. Originating in the Islamic world, the astrolabe was enthusiastically adopted by Christian scholars. Made of metal, full of rotating circles and mysterious inscriptions, it was both a scientific device and a symbol of wisdom. To master it was to see the invisible. But beside astronomy walked astrology, its close, inseparable sister. Medieval astrology was complex, scholarly, and deeply respected. Birth charts were used to predict the fate of kings, the success of marriages, the outcome of wars. Doctors consulted the heavens before performing bloodletting. Cathedral builders chose dates according to constellation positions, and even popes in secret had their horoscopes. The signs of the zodiac appeared widely in illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, frescoes, stained glass, and even church sculptures. Each sign ruled a month, a temperament, a part of the body. Taurus was the neck, Leo, the heart, Pisces, the feet. Thus, the human body was a mirror of the firmament, and healing the body required understanding the stars. It was a universe where science, mysticism, and faith walked hand in hand, without the separation that would later come with the Enlightenment. The influence of Arab astronomers was immense. Figures like Al-Battani, Averroes, and Al-Zarqali translated, adapted, and expanded ancient knowledge. Their astronomical tables, like the Toledan tables, were studied for centuries in Christian Europe. Through them came more refined concepts of orbits, eclipses, and sidereal time. And even without knowing it, Christian monk scribes preserved the legacy of Alexandria. Yet not everyone trusted the stars. Some saw them as temptation, as vanity. Astrology, to certain theologians, was disguised heresy. After all, if everything was written in the heavens, what of free will? That's why many astronomers walked a thin line between permitted knowledge and forbidden insight. And behind windows lit at night, there was always a risk that the next prediction might cost too much. Today, when we look at the sky, we still use terms born in that era. Under astral influence, being on Mars, having a strong Jupiter, being a Libra. We read horoscopes unaware that medieval doctors did the same in the 12th century, and we continue searching the stars for something to explain what we feel inside. Now close your eyes. Picture the clear sky of the Middle Ages. See a solitary astronomer turning his astrolabe under the moonlight. He doesn't want to predict the death of kings. He just wants to understand why night exists, why we dream, why there is so much silence between one star and another. Because deep down, looking at the sky has always been a way to try to hear the voice of God. There is something that never sleeps in times of absolute faith: doubt. And where there is doubt, unrest is born. During the Middle Ages, this unrest whispered through the fields, echoed in forests, murmured among monks, women, beggars, and knights. Because not everyone accepted the official truth of the church. Not everyone kneeled before the same altars. Some looked inward and said, "God is not in the temple. God is within me." And thus were born the movements that the powerful labeled as heresies. The most well-known among them was Catharism, also called the heresy of the good men. Emerging in southern France, Catharism preached that the physical world was a creation of evil. To the Cathars, the true God had not made the earth. The material world, with its suffering, diseases, and wars, was a trap. The soul, pure and eternal, was imprisoned in the body, and the only salvation was to liberate it through purity, non-violence, fasting, and radical simplicity. They rejected marriage, sacraments, the cross, and even the flesh of animals. Their leaders, known as perfectii, lived like monks, walking from village to village, owning nothing, healing, preaching, listening, and for that, they were fiercely persecuted. The church saw in Catharism not just a theological heresy, but a structural threat. The people loved the Cathars. Feudal lords hesitated to hand them over. And so, the response came with violence: the Albigensian Crusade. For 20 years, Christian armies devastated southern France. Entire cities were burned. Thousands died in massacres. An inquisitor, when asked how to distinguish heretics from the faithful in a besieged city, answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." And so it was done. The Cathar movement was crushed, but their ideas never entirely disappeared. And even today, some see in them a forgotten spirituality, freer, quieter, more connected to nature. But the Cathars were not alone. Over the centuries, as mystics, visionaries, and alternative groups emerged that challenged dogma. Some spoke with the dead. Others claimed to have visions of angels, of Mary, of Christ himself. Some of these experiences were accepted, others dismissed as madness. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, for example, had visions throughout her life. She wrote about medicine, cosmology, and theology. She was respected, but other women who claimed to see the beyond were burned. Thus Waldensians, in Italy, defended a Christian life without luxury, without temples, only reading the gospel and sharing. They were persecuted. The Mabeguines and Begards, semi-religious communities formed by lay people, lived in celibacy and voluntary poverty outside clerical authority. They were tolerated for a time, and later condemned, because what frightened the church was not their faith, but their autonomy, their ability to live their faith without priests, without masses, without hierarchy. The spiritual Franciscans, even within the church itself, were persecuted for insisting on a life of absolute poverty, like St. Francis. They said the clergy was corrupt, that Christ would return soon and that the world needed to begin again. This messianic hope was viewed with suspicion, because too many messiahs in unstable times meant revolutions. Prophetic visions also marked the era. There were peasants who claimed to foresee the end of the world, monks who announced plagues, girls who saw hell in their dreams. Many of these visions spread by word of mouth. Some became poems, others threats. In times of plague, famine, and war, any voice proclaiming the punishment is coming gained listeners and fear. And the Inquisition, little by little, expanded its reach. The line between mysticism and heresy was thin. The same act, fasting, having visions, speaking to the beyond, could be seen as a miracle or as witchcraft. It depended on who was watching, the local power, the inquisitor, luck. And so, many kept silent, others fled, and some preferred to die rather than deny what they felt to be true. Today, when we read these names in old documents, it seems all of this is long past, but it's not, because the search for God outside churches continues, because quiet, rebellious, personal faith still lives in many hearts, and because deep down we all want to believe there are more paths to the sacred than those drawn by power. Now close your eyes. Picture a silent mountain, a simple man, barefoot, speaking of light and truth. Behind him the sound of approaching horses. He does not run. He does not fear, because to him, faith is not obedience. It is freedom. Imagine a silent square before dawn. The cold cuts through the air like an invisible blade. In the center, a wooden structure begins to rise. Rope, straw, oil, dry wood. Beside it, men in cassocks watch silently. Soon the church bells ring, but it's not mass, it's not a feast, it's a public execution, because in the Middle Ages justice was a spectacle, and when the courts failed to find proof, fire asked the questions. Medieval justice was profoundly shaped by faith. Trials were not only about civil laws or common crimes, they were also, and often primarily, about the soul. Judging someone for heresy, witchcraft, or ecclesiastical defiance was an attempt to restore divine order. That's why many trials took place inside or around churches. And inquisitors weren't just judges. They were doctors of the soul, sent to heal or to burn. The system of evidence was fragile. Anonymous testimonies, confessions extracted under torture, psychological pressure that lasted for days. Simply being strange, reserved, solitary, or having unusual habits was enough to be suspect. Many confessed just to end the suffering, even if they were innocent. Others remained silent and were deemed guilty, because in that world, doubting the accusation was already defying authority. Among the most famous trials was that of Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl who claimed to hear divine voices. She led armies, won battles, restored hope. But to the English, and to parts of the church, she was a threat, a heretic, a witch. She was captured, interrogated for weeks, accused of wearing men's clothes, of speaking with saints without clerical mediation, of defying the established order. She was burned alive at 19. Years later, she was canonized, and today, she is a saint. The same fire that killed her lit her eternity. Other well-known names also faced symbolic trials. Giordano Bruno, a philosopher and mystic at the end of the Middle Ages, defended the idea that the universe was infinite and that inhabited worlds existed beyond our own. His ideas frightened inquisitors. He was burned in Rome. Jan Hus, a Bohemian reformer, criticized church abuses and preached a faith closer to the people. He too was burned, and in each pyre, silence said more than the flames. But it wasn't just famous names. It was thousands of anonymous people, peasants, midwives, beggars, elders, solitary women, men who read too much, young people who dreamed out loud. All were judged by courts that believed they were defending God, but were often merely defending power. The Inquisition spread across various kingdoms: Spain, France, Portugal, Italy. Its methods varied, but the essence was the same: identify deviation and eliminate it. There were manuals with standard questions, networks of informants, of fear that fed on silence. And the most frightening thing, many times the people applauded, because the fire also warmed collective insecurity. Burning someone was a way to say, "I am not like them." In official records, the trials were long, with hundreds of pages, but deep down the verdict was already decided. Few escaped. Some were forced to wear special garments like the San Benito, a robe that marked shame. Others, before dying, were forced to publicly confess. And when the flames rose, the smell of burning flesh mixed with the sound of prayers, a cruel paradox between salvation and despair. Today we can visit the places where these trials occurred: cathedrals, squares, ancient courts. In many of them there are discreet plaques, other times not even that. But the ground still remembers, the stone still carries the memory, and on very quiet nights, perhaps you can still hear a voice scorched by time, saying it only wanted to be heard. Now close your eyes. See the empty square, the crackling wood, the eyes that do not look away, and among the flames a whisper: truth cannot be burned. Imagine a church bell ringing non-stop, day and night. It's not a call to mass, it's mourning, because each new day brings dozens and sometimes hundreds of martyrs of bodies carried in carts, wrapped in cloth, piled into shallow graves, covered in lime, and no name is spoken, no blessing is given, only silence and haste. This is how Europe sank into its darkest night, a night that lasted not hours, but years. The 14th century was marked by a tragedy many believed to be the apocalypse, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1352, the disease spread with terrifying speed. Coming from the east, infected fleas traveled on rats hidden in merchant ships. When the ships docked, they didn't bring only fabrics and spices, they brought death, and it spread with the wind. The symptoms were brutal: high fever, unbearable pain, dark vomiting, delirium. But the most distinctive sign was the presence of black swellings, the buboes, under the arms, around the neck, and in the groin. They darkened the body even before the soul departed. Hence the name, Black Death. There was no cure, no explanation, only terror. Entire cities emptied. Villages were abandoned. Whole families died in days. It's estimated that over a third of Europe's population was wiped out. In some regions, and half the people vanished. Cemeteries overflowed. Churches stopped burying the faithful. Bones were stacked in churches, on streets, in the corners of city walls. And the smell was a constant reminder that no one was safe. Fear led to social collapse. Many priests and doctors fled. Others died trying to help. Trust in religious authorities crumbled. If the church couldn't explain or stop the plague, then perhaps God had abandoned the world. And in the void of that shattered faith, new monsters emerged. Groups of penitents, the bull-flagellants, marched from town to town, whipping themselves publicly, crying for forgiveness, trying to appease divine wrath. Others sought someone to blame. Minorities like Jews were persecuted, accused of poisoning wells, of spreading the disease through witchcraft. Thousands were killed in massacres fueled by ignorance and despair. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed judgment. And where once there was compassion, hatred took root. Famine followed. With corpses piling up, fields were left untended, markets emptied, prices soared. Children begged for bread. Women sold their bodies for a piece of cheese, and many, unable to endure the suffering, chose suicide. It was as if light had left the world, and in its place, only waiting remained. Even after the plague receded, the trauma lingered. Paintings began to depict the danse macabre, skeletons dancing with priests, kings, nobles, and peasants, a cruel metaphor. Death made all equal. Literature brimmed with apocalyptic visions. The collective imagination began to see life as fragile, fleeting, subject to chance, and art became a mirror of fear. But it wasn't only destruction. The plague, paradoxically, changed the world. With a labor shortage, peasants began to demand better conditions. The economy shifted. Medicine searched for new paths. The absolute power of the church was questioned, and many thinkers realized that if everything could end so quickly, then life must be lived with greater awareness. Darkness gave way to new flames. But it took centuries for pain to become memory. Today, when we read about the plague, it's hard to grasp the scale of panic. But all it takes is a deep silence, a very dark night, the distant sound of a bell, and perhaps we can feel, just for an instant, the weight of uncertainty that filled the air, the sense that every breath could be the last, and the world would never be the same. Now close your eyes, hear the creak of a solitary cart, smell the damp wood, see a man with a strange mask, bird beak, black cloak, a flask of vinegar hanging. He does not heal, he only watches. And you understand, he is the living memory of the day the world stopped breathing. The end of the Middle Ages didn't happen on just any morning, nor was it marked by a bell ringing for the last time. It happened gradually, like light creeping into a room closed for centuries, first as a faint line through the cracks, then as a brightness no one could deny. The medieval world was crumbling, and something new was being born. For more than 1,000 years, Europe had lived under the logic of feudalism, absolute faith, rigid hierarchies, and social immobility. But now, all of that was beginning to dissolve. The plague had killed millions. The abandoned land no longer sustained the lords as before. Peasants began migrating to the cities, and with them, they brought the power of labor. Land was no longer the sole source of power. Now those who controlled trade, navigation, and precious metals began shaping destiny. Cities were growing with stone streets, noisy markets, and a new emerging class, the bourgeoisie. Merchants, bankers, artisans, guild masters, people who were not nobles, not clergy, not serfs, but who were now beginning to gain influence, resources, and above all, a voice. They founded universities, financed churches, invested in ships and ideas. The feudal world, rooted in land and tradition, was slowly giving way to a world urban and in motion. Meanwhile, monarchies were gaining strength. Kings began to centralize power. They created their own armies, collected taxes directly, weakened the local lords, and with that eroded the old system of vassalage. The church's power also faced crises: the Western Schism, rival popes, accusations of corruption, and the rise of heresies. For the first time in centuries, faith was being questioned, not by infidels but by discontent believers. In the shadows of these tremors, the Renaissance began to emerge, not as a total rupture, but as a continuation in a new language. Painters began depicting the human body with realism. Writers returned to Greek and Latin texts. Thinkers started studying the natural world with the eyes of scientists. And for the first time in centuries, the human being became the center of creation again, not merely God's creature, but an active image of the divine. Humanism arose as the seed of the future, in the reading rooms of Tuscany, in the studios of Florence, in the ports of Genoa and Venice. Knowledge once locked away in monasteries now passed into the hands of literate citizens. With the invention of Gutenberg's printing press, books ceased to be rare relics and became tools of transformation. Ideas grew legs. The word now had wings. At the same time, new routes were being charted. The sea was no longer an abyss, it became a path. Explorers like Sir Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan opened the world. New continents, new cultures, new riches, but also new sorrows. Colonialism was born right there. At the very moment the old world was dying, sword and cross would cross oceans, and gold would be poured over empires not yet born. Science was also taking its first steps. Copernicus proposed heliocentrism. Galileo would follow, but already at the end of the Middle Ages, the idea was emerging that the heavens could be understood without needing faith. That would change everything. The stars would cease to be the dwelling of angels and become celestial bodies. Miracle would give way to experiment. Yet even amid so much change, the old world did not vanish. Many structures remained. Churches were reformed, not destroyed. Cathedrals were completed centuries later. Latin still dominated documents. Education was still religious. The new was born over the ruins of the old, but also with its discreet blessing. That's why saying the Middle Ages ended is an oversimplification. It untransformed, and it gave us the world we now call modern, a world of contradictions just like it was, a world of faith and reason, of fear and discovery, of walls and bridges, and above all a world that still dreams of the eternal. Now close your eyes, see the rooftops of ancient cities, smell the paint in a Renaissance workshop, hear the sound of a ship departing for a map that doesn't yet exist. The medieval world did not die. It became the world. Sometimes we walk down a cobbled street, pass through an old archway, hear a distant bell, and something inside us grows silent. It's as if the body remembers a time it never lived, as if the stones carry memories that are not only theirs but also and ours, because even if they say the Middle Ages ended centuries ago, it still lives. It lives in how we organize time, in the calendar we follow, in the words we speak, in the images we dream, the week with 7 days, Sunday as a sacred day, the year divided by religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, Carnival. All of this is a medieval legacy. The clock on the tower, the bells marking the hours, they are not just tradition. They are mechanisms of an era that tried to organize the world through faith. And even today, in modern cities, we look up when we hear the chimes. It is the echo of sacred time that once guided the world. In the words we use, there are traces as well. Terms like knight, lady, fief, vassal, lord, master, disciple, miracle, sacrifice. All were born there, in the way we call a street, or how we see good and evil as absolute opposites. All of that came from the Middle Ages, even expressions that seem natural to us, like hell is other people, light at the end of the tunnel, salvation of the soul, are roots of a world that saw everything in symbols. In architecture, the legacy is unmistakable. Gothic cathedrals with stained glass filtering the divine, stone castles turned into museums or hotels, churches at the heart of every city, sculptures that tell stories, gates that still open to pilgrims, and even in our modern buildings, the structure, the altar, the pulpit, the nave, the dome, still echoes the medieval soul. And it's not just stone, it's also idea. The university that today hosts courses in science, art, and philosophy was born as a space for the theology and logic. The graduation robe, medieval, the structure of faculties, academic rituals, the debate format, all come from there. And even today, when we call someone a doctor, we're repeating the title given to masters of the schools of Paris and Bologna over 800 years ago. Medicine, which now uses machines and artificial intelligence, was born from medieval observations of the body and the humors. The justice system, that now seeks evidence and argument, grew out of inquisitorial courts. Modern politics, with its parliaments and councils, carries the draft of feudal assemblies, senates, and royal courts. And even the very idea of rights, so recent and modern, was seeded by medieval thinkers who dreamed of divine justice incarnated on earth. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Middle Ages lies in the invisible, in how we feel guilt, in how we understand good and evil, in how we believe, and even without realizing, that there is something above us, watching, judging, guiding. Heaven, hell, angels, demons, relics, miracles, all of that still inhabits our imagination. Even when we say we don't believe, we carry the contours of that belief because we grew up inside it. And there's more. The fear of the different, the idolization of heroes, the longing for a Messiah, the condemnation of the flesh, the sanctification of suffering, all of it are emotional and symbolic inheritances from that time, and just as we inherit our grandparents' blood, we also inherit the dreams and terrors of our medieval ancestors. Today, as we end this hours-long journey through the Middle Ages, we see that it's not just a collection of ancient facts. It is a living part of our collective soul, a time that has passed but still breathes in words, in stones, in silences, and in prayers. And when someone says we're too modern to be medieval, just ask, do you still fear hell, believe in eternal love, feel that there is something beyond matter? If yes, the Middle Ages still lives within you. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, feel the voices of the past fade like candles in the wind, and as the last flame dances in the dark, one certainty remains. Not every story ends, some simply fall asleep inside us.